The crystal chandelier cast diamonds of light across the ballroom as Ethan Brooks stood frozen, his daughter's small hand trembling in his. Around them, laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp, musical, cruel. The woman in the red dress leaned toward her companions, her German flowing like expensive wine. Look at them, like pigeons at a peacock party. She didn't know that Ethan understood every syllable. She didn't know that the worn leather notebook in his jacket pocket held more German poetry than she'd ever read. She didn't know that before this night ended, her entire world would shatter, like the champagne flute she raised in mock salute. Some humiliations are designed to be public. Some revelations are designed to be devastating. If you want to discover how one man's silence became the most powerful response in the room, stay with me until the end of this story. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city name so I can see how far this tale of dignity and reckoning travels across the world. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate had witnessed a century of New York's finest moments: debutante balls, political fundraisers, celebrations of inherited wealth, and carefully cultivated power. Tonight, it hosted the annual International Charity Gala, an event where admission cost more than most people earned in 6 months, and where the guest list read like a directory of old money, new fortunes, and carefully curated prestige. Ethan Brooks didn't belong to any of those categories. He stood just inside the arched entrance, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder, acutely aware of every detail that marked them as outsiders. His suit was rented, well-fitted, but lacking the subtle sheen of bespoke tailoring that characterized every other man in the room. His shoes were polished but worn at the heels. His tie, though elegant, had been his only one for 3 years, reserved for parent-teacher conferences and the occasional job interview that required more formality than his usual work clothes. Maya, 8 years old and luminous in a white dress they'd found at a consignment shop, pressed closer to his side. Her dark eyes, so much like her mother's, took in the scene with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. She'd been excited about tonight for weeks, ever since Ethan had explained what they would be doing here. Now, surrounded by women in gowns that cost more than their monthly rent and men whose watches probably exceeded their yearly income, her confidence seemed to waver. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the string quartet's elegant interpretation of Vivaldi. "Everyone looks so fancy." "So do you," Ethan replied, squeezing her shoulder gently. "You're the most beautiful person here." It wasn't flattery. Maya had her mother's grace, that particular quality that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or professional styling. Sophia had possessed it too, an inner radiance that made her remarkable in any setting, whether she wore an evening gown or paint-stained jeans. Ethan felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that came whenever he saw his late wife's features reflected in their daughter's face. They made their way deeper into the ballroom, navigating between clusters of guests who barely registered their presence. Ethan had grown accustomed to being invisible in rooms like this. For the past 3 years since Sophia's death, he'd worked as a maintenance supervisor at a commercial building downtown, the kind of job where people look through you rather than at you, where your competence was measured by how little anyone noticed you were there. Before that, he'd been different. Before Sophia's illness had consumed their savings and forced him to abandon his graduate studies in comparative literature, he'd been on track for an academic career. He'd spoken 4 languages fluently, published papers on cross-cultural communication theory, dreamed of teaching at the university level. That version of himself felt impossibly distant now, separated by medical bills, funeral expenses, and the daily reality of single parenthood on a modest income. But tonight wasn't about what he'd lost. Tonight was about what remained. The one piece of Sophia that could still touch the world beyond their small apartment, still make a difference in ways that transcended their current circumstances. "Table 17, Ethan murmured, checking the placement card they'd been sent. He scanned the numbered markers scattered throughout the ballroom, each surrounded by elegant chairs and crystal place settings that probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget. They found their table near the center of the room, not prestigious enough to be front and center, but not relegated to the margins either. 6 chairs surrounded the white-clothed surface, though only 2 other guests had arrived so far. An elderly couple who nodded politely but made no move to engage in conversation. Ethan pulled out Maya's chair first, then settled into his own, hyper-aware of the weight in his jacket's inner pocket. The leather notebook had traveled with him tonight as both talisman and reminder. a physical connection to Sophia that he couldn't quite bear to leave behind, even for an evening. "Can I have some water?" Maya asked, eyeing the crystal pitcher at the table's center. "Of course," Ethan poured carefully, conscious of his daughter's best dress and the impossibility of explaining stains to the consignment shop where they'd need to return it. "Remember what we talked about? About why we're here?" Maya nodded solemnly. "Mom's painting. We're giving it away to help other people." "That's right." Ethan's throat tightened slightly. "Your mother would have wanted that. She always believed that beautiful things should be shared, not hidden away." "I miss her," Maya said quietly, her small fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "I know, sweetheart. I do too." The moment stretched between them, heavy with shared grief and love. Then Maya's attention shifted, her eyes widening as she took in the spectacle unfolding around them. The glittering jewelry, the elaborate floral arrangements, the servers moving like synchronized dancers with trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. 3 more guests arrived at their table, and Ethan's stomach tightened with recognition. He knew wealth when he saw it, not from personal experience, but from years of observation, from maintaining buildings where people like this worked and played, from understanding the subtle markers that separated old money from new, genuine confidence from performed superiority. The woman who took the seat directly across from Maya was perhaps 30, strikingly beautiful in a red evening gown that looked like it had been designed specifically for her body. Her blonde hair was swept into an elegant updo, and a silver necklace rested against her collarbone, delicate, expensive, and somehow familiar in a way that Ethan couldn't immediately place. She was accompanied by a man about the same age, handsome in the way of people who'd never worried about anything more serious than which vacation property to visit, and an older woman whose resemblance suggested family connection, mother or aunt, perhaps. The younger woman's eyes swept across the table, cataloging each guest with the kind of assessment that Ethan had learned to recognize. When her gaze landed on him and Maya, something shifted in her expression. Not quite disdain, but a subtle tightening around her eyes that spoke of judgment rendered and recorded. "Good evening," Ethan said politely, offering the kind of neutral greeting that required nothing more than basic courtesy in return. The woman's companion nodded briefly. The older woman ignored them entirely. But the woman in red, she smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes, and replied in accented English. "Good evening." Her voice was cultured, European, carrying the kind of confidence that came from never having been told she didn't belong anywhere. "Quite the turnout tonight, yes?" "It's impressive," Ethan agreed neutrally. Maya, more socially fearless than her father, leaned forward slightly. "I like your necklace," she said with the unfiltered honesty of childhood. "It's really pretty." For just a moment, something genuine flickered across the woman's face. Surprise, perhaps, or a brief softening, but it vanished quickly, replaced by that same polite distance. "Thank you," she said, her hand rising unconsciously to touch the silver pendant. Then she turned to her companions, and the conversation shifted into rapid German. Ethan's expression didn't change, but internally, something clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. He understood every word. "Amerikanische Sentimentalität," the woman was saying, her tone carrying amused condescension. American sentimentality. "They always teach their children to compliment strangers. So transparent." The man chuckled. "Well, they certainly look out of place. Did you see a suit? I think it came from a department store." "Lucas, be kind," the woman replied, though her smile suggested she didn't actually disapprove. Perhaps they won the tickets in some sort of raffle. Charity for the charitable, as it were. The older woman joined in, her voice carrying decades of practiced superiority. "Helena, darling, you're too generous. More likely they're here representing some small nonprofit that couldn't afford to send anyone better dressed. How embarrassing for them." Helena, so that was her name, laughed softly, the sound musical and cutting at once. "Well, at least they're trying. That's something, I suppose." Across the table, Ethan maintained his neutral expression, his hand finding Maya's under the table and squeezing gently. His daughter, oblivious to the conversation happening in a language she didn't understand, was watching the string quartet with rapt attention. The leather notebook in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, a physical reminder of Sophia and everything she'd taught him, not just about German language and literature, but about dignity, grace, and the power of choosing when to speak and when to remain silent. Sophia had been a language teacher, specializing in German and comparative linguistics. She'd taught at a prestigious private school before her illness, working with students from around the world, instilling in them not just vocabulary and grammar, but cultural understanding and respect. She'd believed that language was a bridge, not a weapon, a tool for connection rather than exclusion. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. These people, speaking German as though it created a private space for mockery, had no idea they were sitting across from someone who'd spent years immersed in their language, their literature, their culture. He'd read Goethe and Schiller in the original text, discussed Rilke's poetry with Sophia late into the night, helped her prepare lessons on everything from Kafka to contemporary German cinema. But that knowledge belonged to a different version of himself, the graduate student who'd believed in academic careers and intellectual pursuits, before medical bills and funeral expenses had forced him into a different life entirely. "Dad, can we walk around?" Maya whispered, her restlessness evident. Ethan glanced at the program. They had at least 20 minutes before the formal presentations would begin. "Sure, sweetheart. Let's stretch our legs." They excused themselves politely, Ethan noting how Helena and her companions barely acknowledged the courtesy, and made their way toward the perimeter of the ballroom. Maya was drawn immediately to the silent auction displays, tables laden with luxury items and experience packages that people bid on throughout the evening. "Look at this one." Maya pointed to a weekend getaway at a ski resort. "That would be so fun." "It would," Ethan agreed, not mentioning that the current bid exceeded his monthly rent. "What else looks interesting?" They moved slowly through the displays, Maya providing enthusiastic commentary while Ethan absorbed the scene around them. He watched the social dynamics play out. The air kisses and firm handshakes, the practiced small talk and strategic networking, the way certain people commanded attention while others faded into the background. Near the far wall, a velvet rope cordoned off a small gallery space where the evening's featured auction items were displayed. Ethan could see them from a distance, paintings and sculptures, each lit to perfection, each representing significant monetary and cultural value. And there, in the center of the collection, illuminated by a spotlight that made the colors seem to glow with inner fire, was Sophia's final painting. Ethan had seen it hundreds of times, watched it take shape in their cramped apartment, seen Sophia work on it even as her strength faded, understood that it represented both her artistic vision and her farewell to the world she loved. But seeing it here, in this context, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and prestige, made it seem simultaneously more precious and more vulnerable. It was a landscape, though not in any traditional sense. Sophia had painted the view from the window of the hospital room where she'd spent her final months. Not the medical equipment or the sterile walls, but the small park visible in the distance. The trees that changed with the seasons. The glimpse of ordinary life continuing beyond her own struggle. The painting captured something ineffable about hope and loss, about beauty persisting even in the face of mortality. It was, Ethan knew, her masterpiece, not because of technical perfection, though her skill was evident, but because of the emotional truth it contained. "That's Mom's," Maya said softly, following her father's gaze. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice rough with emotion. "That's hers." They stood there for a long moment, a small island of stillness in the bustling room. Then Maya tugged his hand, pulling him back toward their table as the lights dimmed slightly and a voice over the sound system announced that the formal program would begin shortly. As they returned to their seats, Ethan noticed that their table mates had been joined by two additional guests, a middle-aged couple who looked vaguely uncomfortable in their formal wear, suggesting they might be fellow outsiders in this world of old money and inherited privilege. Helena and her companions had continued their German conversation, their voices carrying easily across the table. They seemed entirely comfortable with their rudeness, secure in the assumption that language created an impenetrable barrier. "Der Kleine ist süß genug," Helena was saying as Ethan and Maya approached. "The little one is sweet enough. Aber der Vater, so steif, so ungeschickt. Man sieht gleich, dass sich hier nicht auskennt. But the father, so stiff, so awkward. You can immediately tell he doesn't know his way around here." Lucas laughed. "Vielleicht ist ein Chauffeur oder so etwas. Jemand musste das Kind ja herbringen. Maybe he's a chauffeur or something. Someone had to bring the child here. The older woman added her perspective, her tone carrying the weight of absolute certainty. In meiner Jugend hätten solche Leute nie Zugang zu Veranstaltungen wie dieser gehabt. Standards haben sich wirklich verschlechtert. In my youth, such people would never have had access to events like this. Standards have truly declined. Ethan pulled out Maya's chair, his movements calm and controlled. His face betrayed nothing, not anger, not hurt, not the sharp understanding that cut deeper than they could have imagined. He'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't about responding to every slight, wasn't about proving yourself to people who'd already decided your worth. Sometimes dignity was simply about refusing to let cruelty change who you were. The program began with welcoming remarks from the gala's chairwoman, a silver-haired woman whose family name appeared on buildings throughout the city. She spoke about the evening's purpose, raising funds for educational initiatives and cultural programs, supporting the arts, investing in the next generation. Ethan listened with half his attention, the rest focused on Maya, who was starting to fade slightly despite her excitement. It was past her usual bedtime, and the long day was catching up with her. He made a mental note to let her sleep in tomorrow, to make pancakes for breakfast, to preserve some normalcy after this strange evening in a world so different from their own. The auction began with smaller items, gift certificates, wine collections, jewelry pieces that nevertheless cost more than Ethan's car. The bidding was spirited, competitive, with paddles rising and falling as wealthy guests competed for items they could easily afford but wanted to win. Helena participated enthusiastically, her paddles shooting up for a weekend in the Hamptons, a private wine tasting, a set of first-edition books. She won 2 of the 3, her victories accompanied by applause and congratulations from those around her. "She's very competitive, isn't she?" the middle-aged woman who'd joined their table whispered to Ethan, her English carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "It appears so," Ethan replied neutrally. "We're the Chens," the woman continued, gesturing to include her husband. "Robert and Linda. First time at one of these events. You?" "Ethan Brooks. This is my daughter Maya, also our first time." Linda Chen smiled warmly at Maya. "What a beautiful dress. You look like a princess." Maya perked up at the compliment, her fatigue momentarily forgotten. "Thank you. Dad and I found it at a special store." "Well, you have excellent taste," Linda said. Then, lowering her voice slightly, "I have to admit we feel a bit out of our depth here. Robert's company donated a substantial amount, so they sent us as representatives, but..." She gestured vaguely at the room, at the casual display of wealth surrounding them. "I understand completely," Ethan said, and meant it. It was a relief to talk to someone who acknowledged the strangeness of the situation, who didn't pretend that they naturally belonged in this rarefied atmosphere. The conversation was interrupted by the auctioneer's announcement of the evening's featured items, the artwork that represented the gala's primary fundraising opportunity. The room's energy shifted, attention focusing on the gallery space where Sophia's painting and several others were displayed. "Our first featured piece tonight," the auctioneer announced, her voice carrying practiced enthusiasm, "is a stunning bronze sculpture by the renowned artist Marcus Chen." The bidding was fierce, the price climbing rapidly into 6 figures. Ethan watched with a kind of detached fascination, trying to imagine having the resources to spend that much on a single object, no matter how beautiful. Helena bid aggressively but was eventually outbid by a man in the front row whose paddle never wavered. She accepted defeat gracefully, though Ethan could see the flash of frustration in her expression. 2 more pieces were auctioned, a contemporary photograph and an abstract painting, each fetching impressive sums that would fund months of educational programming and cultural initiatives. And then the auctioneer's tone shifted slightly, becoming more personal, more invested. "Our final piece tonight," she said, and something in her voice made the room go quieter, "is particularly special. It's the work of the late Sophia Brooks, an educator and artist whose influence extended far beyond her too short life." Ethan felt Maya's hand find his beneath the table, her small fingers gripping tight. On the screen behind the auctioneer, Sophia's painting appeared in luminous detail. The park, the trees, the glimpse of life continuing beyond hospital walls. "Mrs. Brooks created this piece during her final months," the auctioneer continued, And tonight, it's being donated by her husband and daughter, with all proceeds supporting language education programs and cultural exchange initiatives, causes that were dear to her heart. The room remained unusually quiet, the kind of silence that suggested people were actually paying attention rather than simply waiting for their turn to bid. "The painting is titled Window of Hope," the auctioneer said, "and I think you'll agree that it captures something profound about resilience, beauty, and the human spirit's capacity to find light even in the darkest times." She paused, letting the words settle. Then she smiled slightly, her professional demeanor softening. "Before we begin bidding, I've been told that Mr. Brooks and his daughter are here with us tonight. Ethan, Maya, would you please stand so we can acknowledge your extraordinary generosity?" Time seemed to slow. Ethan felt every eye in the room turn toward their table, felt the weight of attention that he'd successfully avoided all evening. Beside him, Maya looked up with wide eyes, suddenly uncertain. He could have declined, could have remained seated, letting the moment pass without drawing further attention to their presence. But Sophia wouldn't have hidden. She'd believed in standing up for the things that mattered, and being visible even when it was uncomfortable. So Ethan stood, helping Maya to her feet beside him. The room erupted in applause, genuine, sustained, warmer than anything he'd heard all evening. Across the table, Helena's face had gone perfectly still, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Beside her, Lucas and the older woman wore matching expressions of confusion, slowly transforming into horrified realization. The little girl in the consignment dress and her father in the rented suit weren't random guests who'd wandered into the wrong party. They weren't chauffeurs or nonprofit representatives or raffle winners who didn't understand the social norms. They were the donors. They were giving away something precious, something irreplaceable, to support causes they believed in. Ethan acknowledged the applause with a small nod, his hand resting on Maya's shoulder. He didn't look at Helena or her companions, didn't seek out their reactions. That wasn't why he was here. As they sat back down, the auctioneer began the bidding with an opening price that already exceeded anything Ethan had imagined. The paddles rose quickly, collectors and galleries competing for a piece that carried both artistic merit and the poignancy of its backstory. Helena didn't bid. She sat perfectly still, her earlier confidence evaporated, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like shame. The price climbed higher and higher, and with each new bid, Ethan felt a strange mixture of pride and grief. Sophia's final gift to the world was being valued, appreciated, fought over. She would have been pleased, not about the money, but about the recognition, about knowing her work would continue to touch people, to inspire, to connect. The painting finally sold for a sum that made Ethan's breath catch, enough to fund years of programming, to support hundreds of students, to create opportunities that would ripple out in ways he couldn't fully imagine. As the successful bidder was acknowledged, a museum representative who promised to feature the piece prominently, Ethan felt Maya lean against his side, exhausted but happy. "Mom would have liked that," she whispered. "Yes," Ethan agreed, his throat tight. "She would have." The formal program concluded shortly after, giving way to dessert service and continued socializing. At their table, the Chens offered warm congratulations. The elderly couple, silent throughout most of the evening, expressed their admiration for Sophia's work and the family's generosity. Helena and her companions said nothing. They'd fallen into uncomfortable silence, their earlier ease completely shattered. It was Lucas who finally broke, his voice rough as he spoke in careful English. "Mr. Brooks, we owe you an apology." Ethan looked up from helping Maya with her dessert plate. His expression was neutral, patient, giving nothing away. "We said some things earlier," Lucas continued, clearly struggling. "In German. We didn't think. You assumed I wouldn't understand," Ethan finished quietly, his German flawless and unaccented. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. Helena inhaled sharply. The older woman's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Ich habe jedes Wort verstanden," Ethan continued, his tone calm but carrying an edge that made his meaning perfectly clear. "I understood every word. Meine Frau war Deutschlehrerin. Sie hat mir nicht nur die Sprache beigebracht, sondern auch, dass Sprache ein Werkzeug der Verbindung sein sollte, nicht der Grausamkeit. My wife was a German teacher. She taught me not just the language, but that language should be a tool of connection, not cruelty. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to fade, leaving only the weight of revelation and reckoning. Helena's hand rose to her necklace, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the silver chain. "Your wife," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was her name?" "Sophia Brooks," Ethan replied. "Though she taught under her maiden name, Sophia Hartmann." If Helena had been pale before, she went completely white now. Recognition dawned in her eyes, not just understanding of her mistake, but something deeper, more personal. "Frau Hartmann," she breathed, and her composure finally cracked completely. "Oh God, oh my God." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her hand clutched the necklace at her throat, that familiar silver pendant that Ethan had noticed earlier but hadn't quite placed. Now looking at it directly as Helena's fingers worried the delicate chain, he saw what he'd missed before. The pendant wasn't just decorative, it was a small book, hinged to open, with tiny engraved text visible on its inner surfaces. And he knew with absolute certainty, exactly what those words said, because Sophia had shown him the photograph years ago. She'd given that necklace to a graduating student who'd struggled with confidence, who'd transformed over the course of the year, who'd written Sophia a letter saying she'd changed her life. Helena Kruger. The name clicked into place now, pulled from memory of Sophia's stories about her students, the ones she'd been most proud of teaching. "She gave you that," Ethan said quietly, "at your graduation. You wrote her a letter about wanting to use your family's resources to make a difference in the world. She told me about you." Tears were streaming down Helena's face now, destroying her carefully applied makeup, shattering the polished exterior she'd maintained all evening. "I didn't know," she choked out. "When I read about her death, I was traveling. I couldn't. I didn't know she'd married, had a daughter. I didn't connect." The older woman, Helena's mother, Ethan now understood, had gone rigid in her chair, understanding enough of the situation to recognize its magnitude, even if she didn't grasp all the details. "Frau Hartmann believed in you," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath. "She said you had the potential to be a bridge between cultures, to use your advantages to create opportunities for others. She gave you that necklace because she believed language and understanding could change the world. One person, one connection at a time." Helena's hands were shaking as she unclasped the necklace, holding it out toward Ethan with an expression of abject devastation. "I don't deserve this. After what I said, how I behaved, Frau Hartmann would be ashamed of me." Ethan didn't reach for the necklace. Instead, he looked at Helena with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, simply honest. "My wife believed people could grow, that mistakes were opportunities for learning, that the measure of character wasn't perfection, but what you did after you understood you'd been wrong." He paused, letting the words settle. Around them, their table mates had gone perfectly silent, witnessing a moment of reckoning that transcended social embarrassment or simple apology. "She also believed," Ethan continued softly, "that language reveals who we are. Not just the words we say, but how we choose to use them. Whether we build bridges or walls. Whether we connect or exclude." Maya, who'd been watching with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. "My mom taught people to talk to each other," she said, her child's voice cutting through the tension. "She said that understanding people who are different is one of the most important things anyone can learn." Helena sank back into her chair, still clutching the necklace, her entire body shaking with the force of her emotion. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "to both of you, to Frau Hartmann's memory. I've become exactly what she tried to teach me not to be." The evening that had begun with mockery and assumption had transformed into something else entirely, a moment of truth that no one at the table would forget. And in his pocket, Ethan felt the weight of Sophia's notebook, filled with her handwriting and her dreams, her belief that education could change lives and that language could heal divides. The gala continued around them, but at table 17 everything had changed. The silence that followed Maya's simple declaration seemed to expand, filling the space between heartbeats. Around table 17, the glittering spectacle of the gala continued, waiters gliding between tables with dessert trays, conversations buzzing with the particular energy that came from champagne and successful charity donations, the string quartet shifting into something lighter and more celebratory. But at their table, time had stopped, suspended in the weight of revelation and reckoning. Helena's tears had slowed, but her hand still trembled as she held the silver necklace, that small symbol of a promise she'd somehow lost along the way. The book pendant caught the light, its engraved words a reminder of everything Sophia Hartman had believed about education, dignity, and the responsibility that came with privilege. Ethan watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. Years of working maintenance had taught him to observe without judgment, to understand that people's worst moments didn't always define them. But he'd also learned that apologies meant nothing without action, that regret was easy and change was hard. "Keep it," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "That necklace was a gift from my wife because she saw something in you worth nurturing. Whether you've lived up to that potential isn't for me to judge tonight." Helena looked up sharply, her eyes red and swollen. "How can you be so kind after what I said? What I assumed about you?" "I'm not being kind," Ethan replied, though his tone carried no harshness. "I'm being honest. Sophia gave you that necklace because she believed you could use your advantages to help others. What you do with that belief, whether you honor it or betray it, that's your choice, not mine." He paused, his hand finding Maya's shoulder again in that protective gesture that had become instinctive. "But I will tell you this. My daughter and I came here tonight to give away the last piece of her mother's art. Something irreplaceable. Something we could have kept for ourselves. We did it because Sophia believed that beautiful things should serve a purpose beyond private enjoyment, that education and understanding matter more than possession." Linda Chen, who'd been sitting quietly throughout the exchange, cleared her throat gently. "That's a profound gift," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "Both the painting and the philosophy behind it." Robert nodded agreement. "Our family immigrated 30 years ago with nothing. We built a successful business, but we never forgot what it felt like to be dismissed, to be assumed incompetent because of accent or appearance. What your wife taught, that respect transcends language and culture, that's something the world desperately needs." Helena's mother, who'd remained rigidly silent, finally spoke. Her English was heavily accented but precise. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have also been reminded of something important tonight. My daughter's rudeness came from somewhere, from examples she has seen, from attitudes I perhaps encouraged without realizing their cruelty." The admission hung in the air, surprising in its honesty. Helena looked at her mother with an expression that mixed shock and something like relief, the acknowledgement that patterns of behavior didn't emerge from nowhere, that privilege unchecked became arrogance, that examples mattered. Lucas, who'd initiated the apology, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I work in finance," he said, as though confessing something shameful. "I spend my days around people who measure worth in portfolios and connections. I've become callous, assumed that anyone not in our circles must be less intelligent, less valuable. Your wife's painting," he gestured toward the gallery space where it had hung. "It reminded me that value has nothing to do with price tags." Maya, who'd been listening with the focused attention children sometimes brought to adult conversations they sensed were important, tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad, can I say something?" "Of course, sweetheart." She turned to Helena with the directness only children could manage without seeming cruel. "My mom used to say that mean words were like throwing rocks. Even if you say sorry after, the bruise still hurts. But she also said that people who throw rocks usually learned it from someone else, and the only way to stop was to decide to be different." The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any sophisticated accusation could have. Helena closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, something had shifted, a resolve forming beneath the shame. "Your mother was a remarkable teacher," she said to Maya, her voice steadier now. "And she raised a remarkable daughter. I promise you, both of you, that I will be different. Not just tonight, not just because I was caught and humiliated, but because I remember now why Frau Hartmann gave me this." She touched the necklace again, this time with reverence rather than distress. The elderly couple who'd been silent observers throughout spoke up then, the woman's voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd witnessed something worth acknowledging. "We've attended this gala for 15 years, she said, and this is the first time we've seen anything real happen. Usually it's just expensive performance, people buying social capital, networking, maintaining appearances. What happened here tonight matters more than any auction result." Her husband nodded. "The world needs more of what your wife represented, Mr. Brooks. Education that builds bridges, art that speaks truth, grace that transforms moments of ugliness into opportunities for growth." Ethan felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that came whenever strangers spoke about Sophia's impact. She'd been gone 3 years, but her influence rippled outward still, touching lives she'd never know about, inspiring changes she'd never witness. "She would have appreciated this conversation," he said quietly. Sophia believed that discomfort was where growth happened, that the moments when we confronted our own failings were the moments when we had the chance to become better. A waiter approached their table then, professionally oblivious to the emotional intensity he was interrupting, offering coffee service and petit four. The intrusion broke the spell slightly, returning them to the practical reality of the gala still unfolding around them. As cups were filled and small plates distributed, the conversation shifted into something less raw but no less significant. Helena began asking questions about Sophia's teaching, about the programs she'd developed, about her philosophy of language education. Ethan found himself talking about his late wife in ways he rarely did, not about her illness or death, but about her life, her passions, her beliefs. "She taught at Whitfield Academy," he explained, naming the prestigious private school where Sophia had worked. "But she never believed education should be exclusive to those who could afford it. She volunteered with immigrant communities, ran free weekend classes, created curricula that emphasized cultural understanding alongside grammar." "I remember," Helena said softly. "She used to say that learning a language wasn't about memorizing vocabulary. It was about learning to see the world through different eyes. She made us read poetry and watch films, talk to exchange students, question our assumptions." "That sounds exactly like her," Ethan said, a small smile touching his lips despite the melancholy of the conversation. Maya, whose energy had been flagging, perked up at hearing her mother discussed. "Mom had notebooks filled with ideas," she added proudly. "Dad keeps them in a special box. Sometimes he reads them to me." Helena's expression shifted to something like hunger. "Would you... I know I have no right to ask, but would you ever consider letting me see them? Not to keep, just to read. I've been running my family's charitable foundation for 2 years now, and I've been searching for direction, for programs that would actually make a difference rather than just looking good on paper." Ethan's hand moved unconsciously to his jacket pocket, where Sophia's worn leather notebook rested. The gesture didn't escape Helena's notice, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "You brought one with you," she said. "Of course you did." He hesitated, protective instincts warring with something else. The knowledge that Sophia would have wanted her ideas shared, that she'd filled those notebooks precisely so her thoughts could outlive her limited time. "Not tonight," he said finally. "This one is personal. Her reflections on teaching you, actually, your cohort of students. But I have others at home. Detailed lesson plans, philosophy statements, proposals for programs she never got to implement." Linda Chen leaned forward, interest clear in her expression. "Our company has been looking for educational initiatives to support. Robert and I believe in investing in the next generation, but we've struggled to find programs that genuinely address systemic barriers rather than just offering Band-Aid solutions." "What if we collaborated?" Helena said suddenly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "My foundation has resources and connections. Your wife's work provides the philosophical framework and practical curriculum. The Chens could offer corporate support and real-world implementation experience." She paused, looking directly at Ethan. "And you could ensure that everything stays true to Frau Hartmann's vision." Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not the ache of loss this time, but something closer to possibility. He'd spent 3 years in survival mode, focused entirely on paying bills and raising Maya, on getting through each day without the woman who'd been his partner in everything. The idea that Sophia's work could continue, could grow beyond what she'd managed in her lifetime, was both terrifying and thrilling. "I'm a maintenance supervisor," he said, the words coming out more defensive than he'd intended. "I'm not qualified to run educational programs or manage foundations." "You're a widowed father who learned multiple languages while working full-time and raising a child," Helena countered. "You're someone who maintained dignity and grace even when being mocked by strangers. You understood your wife's work well enough to preserve it, honor it, donate her final painting to support causes she believed in." She shook her head. "Don't tell me you're not qualified. Credentials don't mean anything compared to genuine understanding and commitment." Robert Chen nodded thoughtfully. "My father worked in a factory when we first came to America. He had an engineering degree from Taiwan, but no one would recognize it here. He spent 30 years maintaining machines he could have designed, teaching himself English from library books and television." He paused, his expression carrying the weight of memory. "The most qualified person for any job is the one who truly cares about doing it right. Everything else can be learned." Maya tugged her father's sleeve again. "Mom would want you to do it," she said with the absolute certainty of childhood. She always said her ideas were supposed to help people, not just sit in notebooks. The truth of it hit Ethan with unexpected force. Sophia had been many things: brilliant teacher, talented artist, devoted mother. But she'd never been precious about her work. She'd shared lesson plans freely with colleagues, helped other teachers develop their curricula, believed that good ideas should spread rather than being hoarded. "I would need to think about it," he said carefully. "Talk to Maya's teachers. Make sure any commitment wouldn't interfere with being present for her. My daughter comes first, always." "Of course," Helena agreed immediately. "Family should always come first. That's another thing Frau Hartmann taught me, that professional success means nothing if achieved at the expense of the people we love." Lucas, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up with unexpected insight. "You know what strikes me about this conversation? An hour ago, we were strangers at a table. Now we're discussing potentially transformative educational collaboration. That's exactly what good language teaching should do. Create genuine connection across difference." "My wife would say you're starting to understand," Ethan said, and there was warmth in his voice now, a softening of the earlier distance. The gala was winding down around them, guests beginning to drift toward the exits, satisfied with an evening of successful charity and social networking. But at table 17, no one seemed eager to leave. The conversation had taken on a life of its own, moving from apology to possibility, from shame to potential transformation. Helena's mother, who'd contributed little since her earlier admission, spoke again. "Helena, you should show them the Foundation's current programming. Let Mr. Brooks see what resources exist, what could be redirected or reimagined." She turned to Ethan with surprising humility. "I sit on the board. I can ensure that any proposal receives serious consideration." "Mother rarely makes promises like that," Helena said quietly. "She's very protective of the Foundation's reputation and resources." "Because I have been focused on the wrong things," the older woman replied. "On maintaining prestige rather than achieving impact. Tonight has reminded me that true legacy comes from meaningful work, not social position." The elderly couple preparing to leave stopped by the table one final time. "Whatever comes from this evening," the woman said, "I hope you'll remember that you have allies, people who saw what happened here and understood its importance. Change doesn't happen in isolation. It requires community, support, persistence." As they departed, the table's dynamic shifted again. Maya was drooping against her father's side, exhausted by the long evening and the emotional intensity of conversation she only partly understood. Ethan checked his watch, nearly 10 o'clock, well past her bedtime. "We should go," he said, preparing to gather their belongings. "Wait," Helena said, pulling out her phone. "Can I have your contact information? I don't want this conversation to end tonight and then fade into good intentions that never materialize." Ethan hesitated only briefly before providing his email and phone number. Linda Chen did the same, as did Helena's mother, creating a small network of people connected by an evening's unexpected revelation. As Ethan helped Maya into her coat, a second-hand find that nevertheless kept her warm, Helena approached them one final time. She'd removed the silver necklace and held it out again, but this time with different intent. "I'm not giving this back," she said firmly, seeing Ethan's expression. "But I want to add something to it with your permission. A small charm or engraving acknowledging your wife's full name, her years of teaching, her legacy, so that whenever I wear it, I remember not just my own achievement, but the teacher who made it possible. Ethan considered this, then nodded slowly. Sophia would have liked that. She believed objects should tell stories, carry meaning beyond their material value. There's something else, Helena continued, her voice dropping slightly. The quote engraved inside the book pendant. I've been wearing it for years, but I realize now I never fully understood it. I memorized the German words, but not their true meaning. She opened the tiny book, revealing the cramped inscription inside. Die Grenzen meiner Sprache bedeuten die Grenzen meiner Welt. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world, Ethan translated softly. Wittgenstein. Sophia loved that quote. She said it captured everything she believed about why language education matters. I thought it meant that learning languages expanded opportunities, Helena said. Professional advantages, travel possibilities, career options. That's part of it, Ethan agreed. But Sophia believed it meant something deeper. That the way we use language, not just which languages we speak, but how we choose to communicate, determines the size of our world, whether we include or exclude, whether we build understanding or reinforce division, whether we see other people as fully human or as caricatures. Helena closed her eyes briefly. I've been treating language as a weapon, a way to create private spaces for mockery, to establish superiority, to exclude people I judged unworthy of inclusion. And now, Ethan asked, his tone neutral but not unkind. Now I remember that Frau Hartmann gave me this necklace with a challenge, to use what I'd learned to expand my world, not to fortify it against others. Helena fastened the necklace back around her throat, the silver pendant settling into its familiar place. I won't forget again. I promise you that. Maya, half asleep against her father's side, murmured something indistinct. Ethan scooped her up easily, settling her weight against his shoulder with the practiced ease of single parenthood. She's beautiful, Linda Chen said softly. Your wife must have been remarkable to have created such a lovely child and such a meaningful legacy. She was, Ethan said simply, and the grief in his voice was matched by pride, by love that transcended loss. As they finally moved toward the exit, navigating through the thinning crowd, Ethan felt the leather notebook in his pocket one final time. He thought about Sophia sitting at their kitchen table late into the night, filling pages with lesson plans and philosophical reflections, dreaming about programs she might create if time and resources allowed. She'd run out of time, but perhaps the resources were finally emerging, not through grant applications or institutional approval, but through human connection, through a moment of ugliness transformed into opportunity for genuine change. The January air hit them as they stepped outside, cold enough to make Ethan adjust Maya's coat, even though she barely stirred in his arms. The city sprawled around them, millions of lives intersecting in complex patterns, each person carrying their own stories, assumptions, limitations, and possibilities. Behind them, still inside the ballroom's warmth, Helena stood with her mother and Lucas, all three looking somewhat shell-shocked by the evening's revelations. Linda and Robert Chen joined them, and Ethan watched through the glass doors as the unlikely group began talking with animated gestures, already planning, already imagining what collaboration might look like. A taxi pulled up to the curb, summoned by the gala's valet service. Ethan settled Maya into the back seat, buckling her in carefully before providing his address to the driver. As the car pulled into traffic, he looked back one final time at the Whitmore estate, its windows blazing with light, its interior filled with people whose lives had briefly intersected with his own in ways none of them could have anticipated. Maya stirred slightly, her eyes opening just enough to focus on her father's face. "Did we do good tonight, Dad? With Mom's painting?" "Yes, sweetheart," Ethan said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "We did very good. Your mother would be proud of us." "And of the lady who was mean but then wasn't?" Ethan smiled despite himself. Maya's ability to distill complex situations into simple truth never ceased to amaze him. "Yes, I think your mother would be proud of her too. People can change, Maya. Sometimes all it takes is being reminded of who they wanted to be before they forgot." "Like in the stories Mom used to tell," Maya murmured, already drifting back towards sleep. "Where people make mistakes but then fix them, and everyone gets better. Exactly like that. The taxi navigated through Manhattan traffic, carrying them away from the world of galas and auctions, back toward their modest apartment in a neighborhood where people struggled with rent and worked multiple jobs and didn't wear designer gowns on ordinary Tuesdays. But Ethan felt different than he had that morning. Not transformed exactly, but shifted, as though a door he'd thought permanently closed had cracked open just slightly. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Helena. "Thank you for tonight, for your grace and your honesty. I meant what I said about collaboration. When you're ready to talk seriously, I'll be ready to listen. And to work." He didn't respond immediately, letting the message sit while he processed everything that had happened. The mockery, the revelation, the reckoning, the possibility of something new emerging from confrontation and truth-telling. Another buzz. Linda Chen this time. "Robert and I were serious about supporting educational initiatives. Your wife's vision deserves implementation. Let's talk soon about making it real." And then Helena's mother, her English formal but sincere. "I apologize for my part in this evening's rudeness. I would be honored to help bring your wife's work into the world. She taught my daughter important lessons that I had let her forget. I will not make that mistake again." Ethan looked down at Maya, now fully asleep against his shoulder, trusting and peaceful. He thought about the choices ahead, whether to keep Sophia's notebooks safely preserved as private treasures or to risk sharing them, whether to maintain his comfortable invisibility or to step into something more visible and uncertain. The taxi crossed into their neighborhood, where bodegas stayed open late, and neighbors knew each other's names, where life was harder, but often more honest than in the rarefied spaces they'd just left. This was home. Not glamorous, not prestigious, but real and solid and theirs. But maybe, Ethan thought, home didn't have to be the limit of their world. Maybe Sophia's work could build bridges between these different spaces, could create pathways for students who deserved opportunities regardless of their zip codes or bank balances. The car stopped in front of their building. Ethan paid the driver, tipping generously despite their tight budget. Tonight had been worth the expense, worth stepping outside their normal routine. He carried Maya upstairs, navigating the familiar stairs to their third-floor apartment, unlocking the door to the small space that held all their memories and possessions. He laid Maya gently on her bed, removing her shoes and coat, but leaving the dress. He'd deal with returning it to the consignment shop tomorrow. She murmured something about her mother's painting, about making people happy, about being proud, then settled into deep sleep. In the living room, Ethan finally pulled out Sophia's leather notebook, opening it to familiar pages filled with her distinctive handwriting. The entry he'd thought about during the gala was near the middle, dated several years before her death. Taught Helena Kruger's class today about linguistic empathy, the ability to understand that how we speak shapes how we think, and how we think shapes how we treat others. Helena wrote an essay that gave me hope. She understands that privilege isn't just about money or status, but about access to communication, to being heard and understood. I gave her my mother's necklace, the one with the Wittgenstein quote. If she remembers its meaning, she could do remarkable things. If she forgets, she'll become exactly what the world expects of wealthy young women. I hope she remembers. Ethan closed the notebook slowly, understanding now why that necklace had seemed familiar, why Sophia's choice of gift had carried such significance. She'd been investing in a future she wouldn't live to see, planting seeds she'd never watch grow, believing that education could transform not just individual lives, but the systems and structures that shaped entire communities. He thought about Helena's tears, about her mother's admission, about the unexpected coalition forming around ideas Sophia had developed in this very apartment, sitting at their second-hand kitchen table, believing that beautiful things should serve purposes beyond private enjoyment. Maybe this was how legacy actually worked, not as planned institutional programs or official recognition, but as messy human moments when truth disrupted comfortable assumptions and forced people to confront the gap between who they were and who they'd hoped to become. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a group message, Helena adding everyone from their table to a single conversation thread. "First meeting next Thursday? I've booked a conference room. We have work to do." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the weight of decision pressing against the familiar comfort of routine. Then Maya's voice drifted from her bedroom, still mostly asleep, but clear enough to hear. Mom says it's okay to be scared of new things, Dad. She says brave just means doing them anyway. He smiled, suspecting she was dreaming, replaying conversations they'd had on other nights when change felt overwhelming. But the timing was too perfect to ignore, the wisdom too exactly what he needed to hear. Yes, baby, he said softly, even though she probably couldn't hear him. That's exactly what brave means. He typed out his response to the group message. Thursday works. Let's talk about what education that builds bridges actually looks like. I'll bring Sophia's notebooks. The replies came quickly. Enthusiasm, gratitude, commitment to showing up and doing the work. Ethan set his phone aside and moved to the window, looking out at the city spread below, thinking about all the invisible people working night shifts and raising children and carrying dreams that had nothing to do with wealth or status or social recognition. Those were the people Sophia had wanted to reach. The students she'd believed deserved access to opportunities regardless of their starting point. And maybe, just maybe, her work was about to reach further than she'd ever managed in her lifetime. The worn leather notebook sat on the coffee table, its pages filled with ideas waiting to find their moment, their implementation, their chance to prove that language really could expand worlds rather than limiting them. Tomorrow, Ethan would need to figure out logistics, childcare for Thursday's meeting, time off from work, how to navigate conversations with people whose resources and connections far exceeded his own. But tonight, he simply stood at the window and let himself feel something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. The possibility that loss didn't have to be the end of the story, that beauty could serve purposes beyond grief, that a single moment of truth-telling could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. Maya was asleep, safe, and loved. Sophia's painting would fund years of educational programming. And her notebooks, those worn pages filled with revolutionary ideas disguised as lesson plans, were about to find their way into the world. It was enough. For tonight, it was more than enough. Thursday arrived faster than Ethan had anticipated, the days between the gala and the scheduled meeting consumed by the practical realities of his life. He'd had to negotiate time off with his supervisor, a conversation that required carefully balanced honesty about where he was going without revealing details that might invite skepticism or uncomfortable questions about why a maintenance worker was meeting with foundation executives and corporate leaders. Family matter, he'd said finally, which was true enough. Everything about this meeting traced back to Sophia, to the family they'd built together, to the legacy she'd left behind. His supervisor, a gruff man named Martinez, who'd always treated Ethan with quiet respect, had simply nodded. Take what you need. You never asked for anything, Brooks. Time you did. Now Ethan stood outside a glass tower in Midtown, Maya's hand in his once again, both of them dressed more carefully than usual, but still noticeably different from the stream of professionals flowing through the building's revolving doors. He'd taken Maya out of school for the afternoon, a decision that had required its own negotiation with her teacher, who'd been surprisingly supportive once he'd explained the situation. Educational opportunity, Mrs. Patterson had said firmly. Sometimes the most important lessons happen outside classroom walls. Bring her back tomorrow with stories to share. The building's lobby was all polished marble and strategic lighting, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Ethan approached the security desk with the confirmation email Helena had sent, watching the guard's expression shift from professional courtesy to subtle surprise as he verified their names against the visitor log. 32nd floor, the guard said, handing over temporary badges. Conference room C, they're expecting you. The elevator ride was smooth and silent, the kind of engineering that cost more than Ethan wanted to think about. Maya pressed close to his side, her earlier excitement tempered by the imposing nature of their surroundings. It's okay to feel nervous, Ethan said quietly. I feel it too. But we're doing something important, Maya replied, as much reminder to herself as statement of fact, like Mom would have wanted. Exactly like that. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that managed to be both austere and welcoming. Minimalist furniture, carefully chosen art, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the city sprawling below. A young woman at the desk smiled warmly as they approached. Mr. Brooks? And this must be Maya. Miss Kruger asked me to bring you directly to the conference room. Can I get either of you anything? Water, coffee, juice? Water would be great, Ethan said. And maybe juice for Maya? Of course. Right this way. She led them down a hallway lined with photographs, images from the Kruger Foundation's various projects around the world, schools and community centers, and programs that clearly represented significant investment and careful planning. Ethan studied them as they walked, trying to imagine Sophia's work fitting into this context, trying to reconcile the intimate scale of her teaching with the institutional grandeur surrounding him. Conference Room C was already occupied when they arrived. Helena stood as they entered, her expression mixing professional courtesy with something more personal, nervousness perhaps, or the lingering weight of their last encounter. She'd dressed more conservatively than at the gala, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple style, the silver necklace visible at her throat. Linda and Robert Chen were already seated, as was Helena's mother, whose name Ethan had learned was Margaret. Two additional people he didn't recognize occupied chairs near the windows, a younger woman with dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, and a man perhaps Ethan's age whose casual confidence suggested comfort in rooms like this. Ethan, Maya, thank you for coming, Helena said, moving forward to greet them. She crouched slightly to address Maya directly. I'm glad you're here. Your perspective matters as much as any adult's. You knew your mother in ways none of us did. Maya, bolstered by the direct acknowledgement, found her voice. She talked about teaching a lot, about how it was the most important job anyone could do. She was right, Helena said simply. Then, rising, she gestured toward the table. Please, sit. Let me introduce everyone properly. The introductions unfolded with careful formality. The younger woman was Aisha Patel, Director of Program Development for the Kruger Foundation, responsible for evaluating proposals and overseeing implementation. The man was James Chen, Robert and Linda's son, who ran the family company's corporate social responsibility initiatives. I wanted a working group, Helena explained as everyone settled into seats around the polished conference table. Not a theoretical discussion, but people who can actually move ideas into action. Aisha knows what's possible within foundation structures. James understands corporate partnership models. My mother sits on the board and can navigate institutional resistance. Robert and Linda bring implementation experience and business acumen. And you wanted me because I have Sophia's notebooks, Ethan said, not quite a question. I wanted you because you understand what your wife was actually trying to accomplish, Helena corrected. The notebooks are resources, certainly, but you're the person who can tell us when we're drifting away from her vision, when we're turning revolutionary ideas into comfortable programs that don't actually challenge anything. The honesty of it took Ethan slightly off guard. He'd expected to be treated as a sort of ceremonial presence, his approval sought for plans already mostly formed. Helena's statement suggested something more genuine, a real desire for his perspective, his guidance, his willingness to push back. Aisha leaned forward, her expression intense. I've worked in educational philanthropy for 8 years. I've seen hundreds of programs that claim to address systemic barriers, but really just create feel-good opportunities for donors. When Helena told me about your wife's teaching philosophy, about linguistic empathy and education as bridge building rather than gatekeeping, I got excited. That's transformative thinking. But transformative thinking gets watered down quickly in institutional settings. Which is why we need someone at the table who won't let that happen, James Chen added. Someone who has skin in the game, who cares more about honoring a legacy than about making foundations and corporations comfortable. Ethan felt Maya's hand find his beneath the table, her small fingers squeezing gently. He thought about walking away, about protecting Sophia's notebooks from potential corruption or dilution, about maintaining control over what remained of her professional life. But he also thought about her sitting at their kitchen table, frustrated by institutional barriers and limited resources, dreaming about programs she couldn't implement alone. I brought 3 notebooks, he said, pulling them from the messenger bag he'd carried. The leather was worn soft with age and handling, each one filled with Sophia's distinctive handwriting. They represent different aspects of her thinking. This one, he laid the first on the table, is her core philosophy. Why language education matters, how it should be approached, what makes it transformative versus merely functional. He opened it to a page he'd marked earlier, Sophia's words clear despite years of handling. Helena leaned forward to read, and Ethan saw her eyes widen slightly with recognition. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the notebook. Ethan nodded, and Helena began reading aloud, her voice careful with the weight of words she'd heard before in different contexts. Language education, properly understood, is not about acquiring skills for professional advancement or tourist convenience. It is about expanding one's capacity for empathy, for understanding that different linguistic frameworks represent different ways of experiencing and organizing reality. When we teach language without cultural context, without historical understanding, without genuine respect for the communities who speak it, we create functional parrots rather than engaged global citizens. She paused, her hand rising unconsciously to touch the necklace at her throat. I remember her saying something similar in class, about how learning German vocabulary lists without understanding German history, philosophy, art, and contemporary culture was like learning to use a tool without understanding what it was meant to build. She was suspicious of utilitarian approaches, Ethan confirmed. Sophia believed that treating language as purely functional, as a means to an end, missed the entire point. Language shapes thought. Thought shapes behavior. Behavior shapes culture. If you want to change how people treat each other, you start with how they communicate. Margaret, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up with surprising emotion. My daughter's rudeness at the gala, speaking German as though it created privacy, using language as a weapon of exclusion, that was the exact opposite of what Frau Hartmann taught. And I enabled it. I modeled it even. Most language education does enable it, Aisha said bluntly. We teach languages as status markers, as credentials for elite opportunities, as tools for maintaining or accessing privilege. The entire structure of language learning in this country reinforces class divisions and cultural hierarchies. Which is what Sophia wanted to disrupt, Ethan said, opening the second notebook. This one contains her proposals for community-based language programs. She designed curricula specifically for immigrant communities, for refugees, for people whose first languages weren't English but who faced constant pressure to assimilate without any acknowledgement of what they were being asked to give up. Robert Chen reached for the notebook with reverent hands. May I look at this one? My father's experience, his engineering degree meaning nothing here, his expertise invisible because of accent and appearance, that shaped our entire family's trajectory. Of course, Ethan said, sliding it across the table. Robert began paging through carefully, his expression growing more animated with each section he read. She's addressing everything, not just language acquisition, but cultural translation, professional credentialing, the psychological impact of linguistic marginalization. This isn't just curriculum, this is a complete framework for addressing systemic barriers. Linda leaned over her husband's shoulder, reading along. Look at this section on dignity-centered pedagogy. She's arguing that how we teach matters as much as what we teach, that students need to feel valued for what they bring to the classroom, not just corrected for what they lack. That was fundamental to her approach, Ethan confirmed. Sophia believed that traditional educational models, teacher as expert, student as empty vessel, reinforced exactly the power dynamics that needed to be challenged. She wanted reciprocal learning, where teachers acknowledged what they gained from students' perspectives and experiences. James Chen was taking notes rapidly, his excitement evident. This has corporate training applications too. We work with multinational teams constantly. The way we typically approach cross-cultural communication is superficial at best, offensive at worst. If we applied this framework to professional development, he trailed off, ideas clearly forming faster than he could articulate them. Helena picked up the third notebook, handling it with the same care she'd shown the others. What's in this one? Assessment and accountability, Ethan replied. Sophia was practical about program evaluation. She knew that funders and institutions needed measurable outcomes, but she was deeply critical of how those metrics usually worked. Test scores and proficiency levels didn't capture what she thought mattered most. Aisha practically lunged for the notebook. Please tell me she developed alternative assessment frameworks. That's my white whale, figuring out how to measure transformative educational impact without reducing it to standardized testing. Ethan couldn't help smiling at her enthusiasm. She spent 2 years developing assessment tools that measured linguistic empathy, cultural competency, and what she called communicative courage, the willingness to engage across difference even when it's uncomfortable. That's exactly what we need, Aisha said, already reading. Metrics that actually align with stated values, instead of just measuring what's easy to quantify. Maya, who'd been listening quietly while coloring in a notebook Helena had provided, suddenly spoke up. My mom used to say that the best test was whether people were kinder after learning than before. She said you could speak perfect grammar and still be mean, so grammar wasn't what mattered most. The room went quiet, the simplicity of the observation landing with unexpected force. Out of the mouths of babes, Margaret said softly. That is the question, isn't it? Are our programs making people kinder, more understanding, more capable of genuine connection? Or are we just creating more sophisticated ways to maintain existing hierarchies? Helena closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. At the gala, I spoke perfect German, grammatically flawless, idiomatically correct, and I used it to be cruel. Everything Frau Hartmann tried to teach me about language as bridge building, and I turned it into a weapon the moment I felt superior enough to do so. But you're here now, Ethan said quietly. Trying to do better. That counts for something. Does it? Helena's voice carried genuine uncertainty. Or am I just trying to assuage guilt, to perform redemption without actually changing the systems that enabled my behavior in the first place? Aisha answered before Ethan could. That depends entirely on what happens next. Guilt is easy. Sustained commitment to structural change is hard. Your foundation has resources that could genuinely disrupt traditional language education models. The question is whether you're willing to make decisions that might make you uncomfortable, that might challenge your board, that might redirect funds from prestigious but ineffective programs to messier, more authentic work. I'm willing, Helena said firmly. Mother? Margaret nodded slowly. I am also willing, though I suspect I will need to be educated along the way, to unlearn assumptions I have carried for decades. That's what Sophia's entire philosophy was built on, Ethan said. The belief that everyone, regardless of age, status, or position, needed to remain learners. That the moment you stopped questioning your assumptions was the moment you stopped growing. Robert Chen looked up from the notebook he'd been studying. There's a section here about funding models. Your wife was critical of traditional grant structures that required extensive reporting, strict outcome metrics, and top-down control. She proposed something she called trust-based funding, providing resources and support to community organizations without micromanaging implementation. She hated how much time teachers and community leaders spent on paperwork to satisfy funders instead of actually serving students, Ethan explained. She thought the power dynamics were backwards, that the people doing the work knew best what was needed, and funders should be supporting rather than directing. That's radical, James said, but his tone was admiring rather than critical. Most corporate philanthropy is about control, about ensuring brand alignment and measurable ROI. What you're describing would require genuine trust and comfort with uncertainty. It would also require acknowledging that failure is part of learning, Aisha added. That not every program will succeed, and that's okay as long as we're learning from what doesn't work. But most funders can't tolerate that level of risk or ambiguity. Then most funders are failing the communities they claim to serve, Linda said bluntly. Our company built itself on immigrant labor and multicultural perspectives. We owe our success to people who navigated linguistic and cultural barriers every single day. If we can't trust those communities to know what they need, we have no business claiming to support them. The conversation was gaining momentum, ideas building on each other with the particular energy that came when people who genuinely cared about something found themselves in alignment. Ethan felt simultaneously energized and overwhelmed, aware that they were discussing concepts and programs that extended far beyond anything he'd imagined when Helena first suggested collaboration. Maya tugged his sleeve. Dad, I need to use the bathroom. Of course, sweetheart. He looked to Helena, who immediately stood. I'll show you where it is, and maybe we can grab more snacks from the kitchen on the way back. As they left, Ethan found himself alone with the others for the first time. The dynamic shifted slightly, became more candid. Your daughter is remarkable, Robert said. To maintain such clarity and wisdom while grieving her mother, that speaks to extraordinary parenting. She's had to grow up too fast, Ethan replied, the admission coming easier with Helena temporarily absent. Some days I worry that I'm asking too much of her, letting her be part of conversations about her mother's work when she should just be allowed to be a kid. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, Linda said gently, and including her in this honors both her and her mother. She's not just a passive recipient of legacy. She's an active participant in shaping it. Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. Mr. Brooks, I must ask you something directly. Do you trust my daughter? After what happened at the gala, after the cruelty she displayed, do you believe she's capable of honoring your wife's work? Or do you think this is performance, guilt-driven theater that will fade once the shame recedes? The bluntness of the question demanded equal honesty in response. Ethan considered carefully before answering. I think Helena is genuinely shaken by what happened, he said finally. I think confronting the gap between who she thought she was and who she actually behaved as has created real crisis. But I also think that crisis could go in multiple directions. She could do the hard work of sustained change, or she could eventually rationalize her behavior, decide she's been sufficiently punished, and return to comfortable patterns. And you're here anyway, Margaret observed, despite that uncertainty. I'm here because Sophia's work deserves a chance to continue, Ethan said, because even imperfect collaboration toward meaningful goals is better than perfect preservation of ideas that never get implemented. Because my wife believed in people's capacity for growth, and I owe it to her memory to extend that same belief. Aisha had been listening intently. What would make you walk away? She asked. What would signal that this collaboration was becoming the kind of comfortable, ineffective programming your wife opposed? Ethan appreciated the question's directness. If decisions started prioritizing donor comfort over community need, if we found ourselves watering down challenging concepts to make them more palatable, if the people we claim to serve became props for programs designed to make funders feel good rather than to actually transform systems. Those are good guardrails, James said. We should formalize them. Create accountability mechanisms that give you and community representatives authority to push back, to demand realignment with core principles. Robert nodded agreement. In business, we call that stakeholder governance. The people most affected by decisions get meaningful input into those decisions. It's basic ethics, though surprisingly rare in philanthropic contexts. Helena and Maya returned then, the little girl carrying a plate of cookies and fruit that she carefully set in the table's center. Helena had clearly taken a moment to compose herself. Her eyes were slightly red, but her expression was determined. I heard part of what you were discussing, she said, resuming her seat, about accountability and governance. I want to propose something formal, not just my foundation's money with loose oversight, but a genuine partnership structure. Mr. Brooks, Ethan, I want you to serve as co-director of whatever program we develop. Equal authority, equal decision-making power, not advisory, not ceremonial, actual leadership. Ethan stared at her, certain he'd misheard. I'm a maintenance supervisor. I have no credentials in education administration, no experience running programs at institutional scale. You have something more valuable, Helena countered. You have your wife's complete body of work, detailed understanding of her philosophy, and personal stake in ensuring her vision isn't corrupted. You also have no investment in existing power structures, no career advancement reasons to compromise principles for professional relationships. She's right, Aisha said. Traditional credentials often mean traditional thinking. Some of the most transformative educational leaders I've worked with came from unexpected backgrounds. Former students, community activists, people who understood problems from lived experience rather than academic theory. But my lived experience is maintenance work and single parenthood, Ethan protested. I dropped out of graduate school to pay medical bills. I speak multiple languages but haven't taught since before Maya was born. I'm not qualified for institutional leadership. Margaret fixed him with a steady gaze. You stood in a ballroom full of people who dismissed you, endured mockery in a language you understood perfectly, and maintained dignity and grace throughout. Then, when confronted with my daughter's breakdown and apology, you responded with both honesty and compassion. Those are leadership qualities that cannot be taught. And you've been leading all along, Linda added. Raising your daughter alone, managing competing demands of work and parenthood, preserving your wife's legacy while building a life after devastating loss. That takes more leadership skill than most executive positions require. Maya, who'd been listening while methodically eating grapes, spoke up with characteristic directness. Dad, you always tell me that Mom believed in people who weren't sure they were ready. You said she picked students for advanced classes not because they had the best grades, but because they had the most curiosity and the most heart. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Ethan had told Maya exactly that, recounting Sophia's teaching philosophy, her belief that potential mattered more than current achievement. He'd never imagined those principles being applied to himself. I would need support, he said slowly, testing the possibility. I'd need Aisha's expertise in program development, James's understanding of institutional partnerships, someone with legal knowledge to navigate nonprofit structures. I couldn't do this alone. You wouldn't be alone, Helena said immediately. That's the entire point. We'd be building something collaboratively, with complementary skills and shared commitment. Your role would be ensuring we stay true to your wife's vision. The rest of us would handle implementation logistics. And you'd need flexibility, Robert added. This couldn't be full-time immediately. You have a child, existing work commitments, practical constraints. We'd need to phase you in gradually, provide support for childcare and transition costs, ensure that serving in this role didn't create financial hardship. The conversation had shifted from theoretical to concrete so quickly that Ethan felt slightly dizzy. An hour ago, he'd expected to share some notebooks and perhaps advise on program direction. Now they were discussing co-directorship, partnership structures, fundamental changes to how he spent his time and energy. Can I think about it? He asked. It's more than I anticipated. I need time to consider what it would mean for Maya, for our life, for Sophia's legacy. Of course, Helena said. Take whatever time you need, but while you're considering, I want you to understand something. This isn't charity or pity. We need you. The foundation needs someone who will challenge us, who will push back when we drift toward comfortable ineffectiveness. Your wife's work is revolutionary, and revolution requires people who care more about transformation than about making powerful people comfortable. James pulled out his laptop, pulling up what appeared to be a preliminary budget framework. We've been doing preliminary analysis. Between the foundation, our corporate commitment, and potential government grant matching, we could be looking at $8 to $10 million over 3 years for pilot programming. That's enough to fund comprehensive language education initiatives in multiple communities, with full support staff, culturally appropriate curricula, and meaningful compensation for teachers and community leaders. The numbers were staggering. Ethan tried to wrap his mind around what Sophia could have accomplished with even a fraction of those resources, tried to imagine programs implemented at scale rather than as underfunded afterthoughts to institutional priorities. But money alone won't guarantee success, Aisha cautioned. We need strong philosophical foundation, clear accountability structures, genuine community engagement. That's where your wife's notebooks become invaluable. They provide the framework that prevents us from replicating existing failures with bigger budgets. They spent the next 2 hours going through the notebooks page by page, with Ethan providing context and explanation, answering questions about Sophia's thinking and intentions. Maya eventually fell asleep on a couch near the windows, exhausted by the long afternoon and the weight of adult conversation. As the light outside shifted toward evening, Helena finally called a pause. We should let you get Maya home, but before you go, I want to show you something. She pulled up a document on the screen at the room's front wall, a draft mission statement, clearly prepared in advance of the meeting. I worked on this after the gala, she explained, trying to articulate what I remembered of Frau Hartmann's teaching, what I'd learned from our encounter. I want your honest feedback. Does this reflect your wife's actual philosophy, or is it what I wish I'd learned? Ethan read carefully, aware that everyone was watching his reaction. The statement emphasized linguistic empathy, dignity-centered pedagogy, trust-based funding, and what it called radical reciprocity. The idea that education should flow in multiple directions, with teachers learning from students and institutions learning from communities. It's close, he said finally, very close. But there's something missing. What? Helena leaned forward intently. Sophia believed that language education needed to address power directly, not just teach communication skills, but help students understand and navigate the power dynamics embedded in linguistic hierarchies. She wanted students to recognize when language was being used to exclude, to manipulate, to maintain unjust systems, and she wanted them to develop tools for challenging those uses. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. That's uncomfortable for institutions and funders. It means creating students who might use their linguistic skills to critique the very organizations teaching them. But Sophia believed that anything less wasn't education. It was just sophisticated compliance training. The room went very quiet. That's the piece that usually gets removed, Aisha said finally. The critical consciousness component. It makes people nervous. Which is exactly why it needs to stay in, Helena said firmly. She turned to her mother. The board won't like this. No, Margaret agreed. They won't. But they should be uncomfortable. Institutions that exist to serve communities should be accountable to those communities, even when that accountability is inconvenient or challenging. Linda and Robert exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. We're in, Robert said, even knowing it might mean supporting programs that critique our own company's practices. That's what genuine commitment looks like. James nodded agreement. We've benefited from systems that were unjust to my grandparents. Time to invest in changing those systems, even when it costs us privilege or comfort. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but maybe its precursor. These people were saying the right things, demonstrating understanding of the challenges ahead. Whether they'd maintain that commitment when confronted with actual resistance remained to be seen, but at least they were starting from genuine awareness rather than naive optimism. I'll think seriously about the co-director role, he said. Talk to Maya's teacher, talk to my supervisor, figure out what's actually possible. But regardless of my answer on that, I'm willing to work with you on developing programs based on Sophia's notebooks. Her ideas deserve a chance to live in the world. That's all we can ask, Helena said quietly. Thank you, Ethan, for trusting us enough to try. As Ethan gathered the notebooks and gently woke Maya, preparing to navigate back through the city to their small apartment, he felt the strange dislocation that came from moving between radically different worlds. In a few hours, he'd be helping Maya with homework, making dinner from whatever was in the refrigerator, preparing for another day of maintenance work that paid the bills, but engaged none of his actual capabilities or interests. But maybe, just maybe, that wouldn't be his entire story forever. Maybe Sophia's work was about to open doors he'd thought permanently closed, create possibilities he'd stopped letting himself imagine. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying them back to street level, back to the version of life they knew. Maya leaned against his side, not quite awake, murmuring something about her mother being proud. I hope so, sweetheart, Ethan replied. I really hope so. The subway ride home felt surreal, the fluorescent lighting and worn seats a jarring contrast to the polished conference room they'd just left. Maya dozed against Ethan's shoulder while he stared at his reflection in the darkened window, watching the city blur past and trying to process everything that had happened. His phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. Hope the family thing went okay. Jenkins called in sick tomorrow, so I'll need you on early shift if possible. 5 a.m.? Ethan typed back his confirmation, the mundane request grounding him in the reality of his actual life. Co-director of an educational foundation was an appealing fantasy, but he still had bills due next week, a daughter who needed new shoes, and a job that required him to show up at 5 in the morning to keep the heat running in a building full of people who'd never know his name. When they finally reached their apartment, Maya revived enough to brush her teeth and change into pajamas before collapsing into bed. Ethan sat beside her, smoothing her hair back as her breathing deepened into sleep. Mom would be really excited about today, Maya mumbled, already half dreaming. About her notebooks helping people. Yes, she would, Ethan agreed softly. After Maya was fully asleep, he moved to the kitchen table where Sophia's remaining notebooks were stacked. There were 17 in total, the 3 he'd brought to the meeting and 14 others, each filled with her precise handwriting, her evolving thoughts on education and language, and how to build bridges across the divides that fractured communities. He opened one at random, finding an entry dated 4 months before her diagnosis, when she'd still believed she had decades ahead to implement her ideas. Met with the Whitfield administration again about expanding the scholarship program. They want qualified students, by which they mean students who already speak like them, dress like them, come from families that understand their cultural codes. I tried to explain that real diversity means discomfort, means students who challenge institutional assumptions, means investing in potential rather than polish. They smiled and thanked me for my input, and nothing will change. Ethan could hear the frustration in her words, could remember the evening she'd written this entry, how she'd come home angry and exhausted, railing against systems that claim to value diversity while maintaining every possible barrier to genuine inclusion. He'd made her tea and listened, offering the kind of support that couldn't solve problems but could at least witness them. His phone rang, startling him. Helena's name appeared on the screen. "I hope I'm not calling too late," she said when he answered. "I wanted to check in, see how you and Maya were doing after such an intense afternoon." "We're fine. She's asleep. I'm just going through more of Sophia's notebooks." "I can't stop thinking about what you said," Helena continued, "about education needing to address power directly. I've been reviewing the Foundation's current programs, and they're all so safe. We teach language skills, but never discuss why some languages have more prestige than others. We provide cultural education, but never examine whose culture gets centered and whose gets marginalized." "That's what Sophia found so frustrating about institutional approaches," Ethan said. "The unwillingness to name systems, to acknowledge that education doesn't happen in a vacuum, but within structures of power that advantage some people and disadvantage others." Helena was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something. After you left, my mother and I had a difficult conversation about how the Foundation has been run, about whose voices get heard in program development, about whether we've been doing actual good or just performing charity in ways that make us feel virtuous." "That sounds painful." "It was, but necessary." Mother admitted that she's spent decades treating philanthropy as noblesse obligée, the wealthy bestowing benefits on the deserving poor. She never questioned whether communities might know better than we do what they actually need. Ethan heard the sound of traffic in the background, realized Helena must be calling from a car or walking outside. "Where are you?" "Walking home from the Foundation offices. I've spent the past 3 hours going through files, looking at every program we fund. And I'm ashamed, Ethan. We spend millions annually, and I can't identify a single initiative that genuinely challenges systemic barriers rather than just helping a few individuals navigate them more successfully." "But you're seeing it now," Ethan said. "That's the first step." "Is it enough, though? Or am I just another wealthy person who has a crisis of conscience, feels terrible for a few months, and then returns to comfortable patterns once the guilt fades?" The question echoed Margaret's earlier challenge, and Ethan appreciated Helena's willingness to voice it herself rather than waiting to be accused. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Change is hard. Sustained change is harder. Systems resist disruption, and you'll face pressure from board members, other funders, people invested in maintaining current approaches. The question isn't whether you feel bad now, it's whether you'll keep pushing when it becomes costly and uncomfortable." "I want to," Helena said, and her voice carried a desperation that sounded genuine. "I want to be the person Frau Hartmann believed I could become, but I'm scared I don't know how, that I'll make mistakes, that my privilege blinds me to things I should see." "Then surround yourself with people who'll tell you the truth," Ethan replied. "Bring community members into decision-making, not just as advisory voices, but with actual authority. Pay people for their expertise and lived experience. Accept that you'll make mistakes and commit to learning from them rather than defending them." He paused, considering whether to share what he was thinking. Sophia had a quote she loved, from a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire. She kept it taped to her desk at school. What did it say? "Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral." She believed that institutions and individuals had to actively work against injustice, that claiming neutrality or good intentions wasn't enough. Helena exhaled shakily. "The board meeting is in 2 weeks. I'm going to propose fundamental restructuring of how we evaluate and fund programs. It's going to be contentious." "Do you need support?" Ethan asked. "Documentation, examples from Sophia's work, anything that might strengthen your case? Would you be willing to attend? Present your wife's philosophy directly to the board? I know it's asking a lot, but hearing from you would carry weight that my summary never could. Ethan thought about facing a room full of wealthy philanthropists, about defending Sophia's radical vision to people invested in maintaining comfortable approaches to charity. The prospect was terrifying, but refusing felt like betraying everything his wife had worked toward. "I'll do it," he said, "but I need childcare for Maya and time off work. And I want Aisha there too. She understands foundation structures better than I do." "Done," Helena said immediately. "I'll arrange everything. And Ethan, thank you for giving me a chance to do better." After they hung up, Ethan sat in the quiet apartment, wondering what exactly he'd just committed to. The 5 a.m. shift started in 6 hours, which meant he should already be asleep. Instead, he was agreeing to board presentations and co-directorship conversations and responsibilities that extended far beyond his current life's parameters. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a blur of competing demands. Ethan worked his regular shifts, helped Maya with homework, attended parent-teacher conferences, and somehow found time for multiple planning calls with Helena, Aisha, and the Chens. The contrast between his days was almost comical. Mornings spent fixing broken HVAC systems and clearing clogged drains. Evenings spent discussing pedagogical theory and institutional reform. Mrs. Patterson, Maya's teacher, noticed the changes. She pulled Ethan aside after school one afternoon, her expression curious but kind. "Maya's been talking about her mother's work," she said, "about important meetings and helping people learn languages. It sounds like something significant is developing?" "Potentially," Ethan hedged. "Some people are interested in implementing my late wife's educational philosophy. It's early stages, nothing certain yet." Mrs. Patterson studied him thoughtfully. "I taught for 15 years in under-resourced schools before coming here. I know what happens when well-meaning people try to help communities they don't understand. But I also know what happens when good ideas die because no one with resources takes them seriously." She paused. "Whatever you're building, make sure the communities you're trying to serve have real power in the process. Not just input, actual decision-making authority." "That's exactly what my wife believed," Ethan said. "Then you're starting from the right place. Just don't lose sight of it when things get complicated. They always get complicated." The evening before the board meeting, Ethan's supervisor called him into the office. Martinez gestured for him to close the door, which was never a good sign. "Brooks, you've been distracted lately. Missing details, showing up tired, asking for schedule changes. You want to tell me what's going on?" Ethan had prepared for this conversation, had rehearsed explanations that would satisfy without revealing too much. But sitting across from Martinez, a man who'd always treated him fairly, despite having no obligation to do so, deception felt wrong. "My late wife was a teacher," he began. "She developed educational programs that some people think could make a real difference. They've asked me to help implement her work, possibly in a leadership role. I've been trying to figure out if it's feasible while maintaining my responsibilities here." Martinez leaned back in his chair, his weathered face unreadable. "Leadership role meaning what, exactly?" "Co-director of a foundation-funded language education initiative. It would start part-time, but could grow into full-time work if the pilot programs succeed. Pay better than maintenance supervision? Eventually, yes, but there's no guarantee. The whole thing could fall apart in 6 months." Martinez was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan braced himself for anger or accusations of disloyalty. Instead, his supervisor smiled slightly. "Brooks, I've known since you started here that you were overqualified for this work. You speak what, 4 languages? You've got education most of our managers don't have. You're careful with details, good with people, smart about systems. I figured you were here because of circumstances, not choice." Ethan blinked, surprised by the assessment. "You never said anything." "Wasn't my business. You showed up, did good work, never complained. That's all I needed." Martinez paused. "But if you've got a chance to do something that matters, something that uses what you're actually capable of, you should take it. Life's too short to spend it fixing toilets when you could be changing lives." "I can't just quit," Ethan protested. "I have bills, a daughter to support, no safety net." "I'm not saying quit tomorrow. I'm saying talk to HR about transitioning to part-time, keep benefits, maintain some income while you test whether this other thing is viable. We can work with you, Brooks. You've earned that flexibility." The unexpected support left Ethan momentarily speechless. Why would you do that? Martinez shrugged. Because I've spent 30 years watching talented people get trapped in jobs that don't use half of what they're capable of. Usually because of bad luck, bad timing, circumstances beyond their control. If I can help someone escape that trap, I will. Call it paying forward the kindnesses people showed me when I needed them. Ethan left the office feeling simultaneously grateful and terrified. The safety net he'd assumed didn't exist was apparently available, which meant the barriers to accepting Helena's proposal were crumbling. The only thing standing between him and fundamental life change was his own fear. That night he talked it through with Maya over dinner. Mac and cheese from a box, their Thursday tradition. The people who like Mom's notebooks want me to help them make real programs, he explained, trying to pitch it at her level of understanding. It would mean less time doing maintenance work and more time doing education work. But it's scary because it's new and uncertain. Maya considered this seriously, twirling pasta on her fork. Would we still live here? Yes. Same apartment, same school for you, same neighborhood. Would you be happier? The question caught him off guard. Why do you ask that? Because you get sad when you come home from work, Maya said matter-of-factly. Not crying sad, but tired sad. Like the work makes you more tired than just doing hard things. But when you talk about Mom's notebooks and the programs, you get excited like you used to when you'd talk about school stuff with Mom. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He thought he'd hidden his dissatisfaction better, had believed that providing stability for Maya meant she wouldn't notice his own unhappiness. But children saw more than adults gave them credit for. I would probably be happier, he admitted. The work would be challenging but meaningful. Using skills I haven't used in years, honoring your mother's legacy, maybe making a real difference. Then you should do it, Maya said simply. Mom used to say that being scared of something good was different from being scared of something bad. That good scared meant you should probably try. When did she say that? When I was nervous about starting school. She said it was okay to be nervous about new things. That nervous meant I cared about doing well. She said bad scared was when something felt wrong, but good scared was when something felt important. Ethan reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. You're very wise, you know that? I had a good teacher, Maya said, and the simple statement carried weight beyond her years. The board meeting took place in a different building than the earlier planning session. Older, more prestigious. The kind of location that announced institutional permanence and serious money. Ethan arrived early, dressed in his one good suit, carrying a leather portfolio Helena had provided filled with selections from Sophia's notebooks. Isha met him in the lobby, her professional attire and confident bearing a stark contrast to his obvious discomfort. Remember, she said quietly as they rode the elevator up, you're not asking for permission. You're presenting a vision that the foundation would be privileged to support. Helena's already laid groundwork with individual board members. Your job is to make Sophia's philosophy real, to help them understand what transformative education actually looks like. The boardroom was exactly what Ethan had imagined. Dark wood paneling, portraits of distinguished-looking founders, a massive table that seated 20. About 15 people were already present, their ages ranging from 30s to 70s, their clothing and bearing announcing wealth and influence. Helena sat at the head of the table, Margaret beside her. She stood as Ethan entered, and he noticed something different about her, a steel in her spine that hadn't been there at the gala, a readiness for confrontation. Thank you all for making time for this special presentation, Helena began once everyone was seated. I've asked Ethan Brooks to join us today to discuss a potential new direction for the Foundation's educational programming. Some of you may remember that we purchased his late wife's final painting at our recent gala. What you may not know is that Sophia Brooks was an extraordinary educator whose work on language learning and cultural bridge building represents exactly the kind of transformative thinking our mission statement claims to value. A man in his 60s whom Ethan didn't recognize spoke up. With respect, Helena, our educational portfolio is already quite full. We fund language programs at 3 universities and 2 private schools. What makes this proposal different? Because everything we currently fund serves people who already have advantages, Helena said bluntly. We provide additional opportunities for students at elite institutions. We don't challenge systemic barriers or serve communities that face genuine linguistic marginalization. The room went very quiet. Margaret looked pleased, which suggested she and Helena had coordinated their approach. Several board members looked distinctly uncomfortable. "I'll let Mr. Brooks explain his wife's philosophy," Helena continued, "but I want to be clear about my position before we begin. I believe the Foundation has been operating from a fundamentally flawed model, one that performs charity while maintaining the very structures that create need for charity in the first place. That changes now, with or without unanimous board support." It was a gauntlet thrown down, and everyone in the room recognized it. A woman with silver hair and impressive jewelry leaned forward. "That's quite an accusation, Helena. Are you suggesting that decades of the Foundation's work have been meaningless?" "I'm suggesting that good intentions without structural analysis often reinforce existing inequalities," Helena replied. "Mr. Brooks, would you share what your wife believed about language education's actual purpose?" Ethan stood, his heart hammering, and moved to the front of the room where Helena had set up a screen. He pulled up the first slide, a quote from Sophia's notebook, her handwriting projected large enough for everyone to see. "My wife wrote this 3 years before her death," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "Language education in America serves primarily to maintain class divisions and cultural hierarchies. We teach the languages of power to those who already have power, allowing them to accumulate more through international business and cultural capital. Meanwhile, we treat the languages of marginalized communities as deficits to be corrected, rather than assets to be honored. True language education would disrupt these patterns, would give tools of power to the powerless, and teach the powerful to listen rather than simply speak." He paused, letting the words land. Several board members were frowning. "That sounds quite critical of traditional educational models," the older man said. "Does Mrs. Brooks's work have any practical applications, or is it purely theoretical critique?" Ethan advanced to the next slide, showing one of Sophia's detailed curriculum frameworks. She developed complete programs for 3 different community contexts: recent immigrant communities, refugee populations, and economically marginalized native English speakers seeking to learn second languages. Each program was designed with what she called dignity-centered pedagogy, which means treating students as experts in their own experiences while providing them tools to navigate systems designed to exclude them. Aisha stood then, moving to stand beside Ethan. "I've reviewed Mrs. Brooks's materials extensively. Her frameworks address every major gap in current language education approaches: cultural competency, power analysis, sustainable community integration, and assessment models that measure actual communicative effectiveness rather than just formal correctness. This isn't theoretical. It's the most practical, implementable vision for transformative language education I've encountered in my entire career." A younger board member, a woman perhaps in her late 30s, spoke up. "I'm interested, but I'm concerned about scale. How would this work beyond pilot programs? How do we measure success in ways that would satisfy our reporting requirements?" Ethan advanced through several more slides, showing Sophia's assessment frameworks, her proposals for community governance structures, her careful analysis of funding models that would support programs without imposing top-down control. "My wife spent years thinking about exactly these questions," he said. "She knew that transformative programs needed sustainable structures, meaningful metrics, and genuine community authority. She proposed what she called trust-based funding, providing resources and support to community organizations without micromanaging implementation, with assessment focused on relationship building, cultural competency growth, and long-term community outcomes rather than short-term test scores." The older man who'd questioned the proposal's practicality cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks, I appreciate your dedication to your wife's memory, but surely you can see that trust-based funding is simply a euphemism for giving money without accountability. Our donors expect responsible stewardship of resources." "With respect, sir," Ethan replied, his patience thinning, "my wife's model includes extensive accountability, just not the kind that lets funders maintain control while claiming to serve communities. Her accountability runs to the people actually affected by programs, not to donors looking for tax benefits and good publicity." Margaret spoke then, her voice carrying authority that came from decades of board participation. "Wilhelm, You've sat on this board for 15 years. In that time, what have we actually accomplished? We've funded scholarships for students who would have succeeded anyway. We've supported programs that make us feel virtuous without challenging any systems. We've treated education as charity rather than as justice. She paused, looking around the table. I'm tired of performing benevolence. I want to do something that actually matters, even if it makes me uncomfortable. The silver-haired woman responded immediately. Margaret, you can't seriously be supporting this. The foundation has a reputation to maintain, relationships with major institutions, expectations from our donor base. Our donor base is mostly wealthy families trying to avoid taxes, Margaret said bluntly. Let's not pretend their comfort is our primary obligation. Our mission statement says we exist to create educational equity. That means disrupting inequity, not just helping a few individuals succeed within unjust systems. The room erupted into crosstalk, board members arguing over each other. Helena let it continue for a moment before calling for order. I'm proposing a 3-year pilot program, she said firmly. $8 million to implement Mrs. Brooks' frameworks in 3 different community contexts, with full community governance, meaningful compensation for participants and teachers, and assessment models that actually measure what we claim to value. Mr. Brooks would serve as co-director with complete authority over program philosophy and implementation. That's an enormous commitment to an unproven approach, Wilhelm protested. We spend $12 million annually on programs that demonstrably don't create systemic change, Helena countered. I'd rather spend $8 million on something with potential for genuine transformation. The question isn't whether this is a risk. All meaningful work involves risk. The question is whether we're willing to risk resources on actual impact rather than safe mediocrity. The debate continued for another hour, with board members raising concerns about accountability, implementation logistics, potential pushback from traditional education partners, and risks to the foundation's reputation. Ethan answered questions as best he could, supported by Aisha's expertise and Helena's unwavering advocacy. Finally, Margaretti called for a vote. Those in favor of approving Helena's proposal for a 3-year pilot program? 8 hands rose, just over half the board. It wasn't overwhelming support, but it was enough. Helena smiled and Ethan saw tears in her eyes even as she maintained professional composure. Thank you, Mr. Brooks and I will begin implementation planning immediately with regular updates to the board on progress and challenges. As the meeting adjourned, several board members approached Ethan directly. The younger woman who'd asked about scale introduced herself as Jennifer Park, a former educator now managing her family's foundation. I supported your proposal because I've seen exactly what Mrs. Brooks described, she said. Elite institutions getting all the resources while communities that actually need support get scraps. If you need additional allies as implementation begins, I'm available. Wilhelm, despite his earlier opposition, offered his hand. I disagreed with the approach, but I respect your commitment to your wife's vision. I hope you prove me wrong about the risks. As people filtered out, Ethan found himself alone with Helena, Margaret, and Aisha. The 4 of them stood in the empty boardroom, the weight of what they'd just accomplished settling over them. We did it, Helena said quietly. We actually did it. We started it, Aisha corrected. Now comes the hard part. Making sure implementation lives up to the vision. Boards approving funding is easy compared to building programs that genuinely transform systems. But we have resources now, Margaret said, and commitment, and your wife's brilliant frameworks to guide us. That's more than most transformative efforts begin with. Ethan looked down at the portfolio in his hands, at Sophia's handwriting visible through the transparent cover. He thought about her sitting at their kitchen table, dreaming about programs she'd never lived to see, believing that education could change the world if approached with sufficient courage and integrity. She would have been terrified, he said softly. Of this much attention, this much funding, this much responsibility. She'd have worried about failing, about her ideas being corrupted, about promising more than could be delivered. But she would have tried anyway, Helena said, because the alternative, keeping her work safe and private and ultimately ineffective, would have been worse than risking failure. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes, she would have tried anyway. His phone buzzed with a text from the after-school program. Maya's ready for pickup whenever you're done with your meeting. She says to tell you she's proud of you. The message made him smile despite the exhaustion creeping through his body. He'd been awake since before dawn, had worked a full maintenance shift before the board meeting, and now faced the evening routine of dinner and homework and bedtime stories. But Maya was proud of him, and Sophia's work was moving into the world. And maybe that was enough for today. I need to get my daughter, he said, but we should meet soon to start actual planning. Community outreach, hiring, curriculum adaptation. There's months of work ahead before we can launch anything. I'll coordinate calendars, Aisha said, and start identifying potential community partners. This needs to be collaborative from day one, not something we develop and then bring to communities for implementation. As Ethan left the building, stepping back into the late afternoon sunlight, he felt fundamentally different than he had that morning. He was still a maintenance supervisor, still a single father scraping by on a modest income, still someone most people would overlook in rooms filled with wealth and influence. But he was also now co-director of an $8 million educational initiative, guardian of his late wife's transformative vision, and someone who'd just convinced a skeptical board to take a genuine risk on structural change. The contradiction was dizzying, and somehow, despite all his fears about inadequacy and failure, it felt exactly right. Maya was waiting outside the after-school program with her backpack and a drawing she'd made. A colorful rendering of what she explained were people from different countries talking to each other and being friends. The teacher supervising pickup smiled warmly as Ethan approached. "She's been telling everyone about her mother's important work," the teacher said. "You're raising a remarkable young woman, Mr. Brooks." On the subway ride home, Maya chattered excitedly about her day while Ethan let the reality of what he'd committed to wash over him. $8 million, 3-year pilot program, co-director. The words felt too large for his life, like trying to fit ocean water into a coffee cup. "Dad, you're doing the quiet thing again," Maya observed, tugging his sleeve. "Are you worried, scared, or excited scared?" He smiled despite himself. Excited scared. Definitely excited scared. "Good. Mom would say that means you're doing something right." Over the next 6 months, Ethan's life transformed in ways both exhilarating and exhausting. Martinez had been true to his word, helping Ethan transition to part-time maintenance work that provided benefits and steady income while he navigated the uncertain early stages of program development. The arrangement meant brutally long days, maintenance shifts starting at dawn, followed by afternoon meetings and evening planning sessions, but it also meant financial stability while building something new. Helena had been equally true to her commitment, though not without struggles. 2 board members had resigned in protest of the new direction, and several traditional partner institutions had expressed concern about the foundation's radical turn. But Helena held firm, supported by Margaret's unwavering backing and growing enthusiasm from board members like Jennifer Park, who saw potential for genuine impact. The first major decision was choosing community partners, and it became the crucible that tested whether everyone's stated commitments to community authority were genuine or performative. Aisha had identified 3 potential sites: a predominantly Dominican neighborhood in Washington Heights, a mixed refugee community in Queens, and a working-class neighborhood in the South Bronx with significant Puerto Rican and Mexican populations. The planning team, which now included Ethan, Helena, Aisha, the Chens, and 3 community organizers Aisha had recruited, gathered for what became a defining conversation about power and process. "We can't just walk into these communities and announce we're here to help," said Maria Flores, one of the community organizers, her tone leaving no room for disagreement. "That's colonizer shit, even when it's well-intentioned. These communities have been helped by outsiders for decades, and most of that help has been extractive or paternalistic or both." Robert Chen nodded vigorously. "My father used to say that the most insulting thing wealthy people did was assume they knew what poor people needed without ever asking. How do we avoid that?" "By giving up control," Ethan said quietly. All eyes turned to him. Sophia's notebooks are full of warnings about this. She said that traditional program development put funders and administrators in charge of design, then brought in community members to provide input or feedback. She wanted to invert that, community members in charge of design, with funders and administrators providing resources and support. That's terrifying for institutions, Helena said, but her tone was thoughtful rather than resistant. It means accepting that communities might make choices we don't understand or agree with. It means trusting people we've been trained to see as needing our guidance. Exactly, Maria said. And if you can't handle that terror, you shouldn't be doing this work. Community-led development means communities lead. Not advise, not provide input, lead. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of genuine reckoning. Finally, Linda Chen spoke up. Then let's do it properly. We bring resources and Mrs. Brooks's frameworks to communities, we explain what we're hoping to build, and we ask them to design programs that serve their actual needs using whatever pieces of the framework make sense in their context. And we compensate them for that design work, James added. Pay community members as consultants, as experts, because that's what they are. No one knows these communities better than the people who live there. Over the next 3 months, the team held dozens of community meetings, not presentations where they talked at people, but genuine listening sessions where they mostly sat quiet while residents shared their experiences with language barriers, educational exclusion, and well-meaning programs that had failed them. In Washington Heights, a woman named Luz Morales spoke with particular eloquence about the assumptions embedded in traditional ESL programs. They treat Spanish like it's something to be ashamed of, something to leave behind. My children come home saying their language is wrong English. How do you think that makes them feel about themselves, about their heritage? Ethan had written furiously during that session, recognizing echoes of Sophia's thinking in Luz's critique. Afterward, he'd approached her carefully. Would you be willing to help design curriculum? He asked. Not just give feedback on what we create, but actually lead the design process? You clearly understand what's broken about current approaches. Luz had looked at him skeptically. I'm not a teacher. I work 2 jobs cleaning offices. What do I know about curriculum design? You know what your children need. You know what your community values. You know what respect looks like versus what condescension looks like. That's more important than formal credentials. And you'd pay me for this work? Absolutely. Consultant rates, same as we'd pay anyone with expertise we need. Luz had studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Okay, but I want other mothers involved too, not just me deciding for everyone. That's the same problem as you deciding for us. Similar conversations unfolded in each community, resulting in design teams that looked nothing like traditional program development groups. Alongside Ethan and Aisha were parents working multiple jobs, recent immigrants navigating complex systems, teenagers serving as translators for their families, elders who'd watched decades of programs come and go without creating lasting change. The curriculum that emerged from these collaborations honored Sophia's core principles while adapting them to specific community contexts in ways Ethan never could have imagined alone. In Washington Heights, the program centered on intergenerational language exchange, elders teaching Spanish literacy and cultural knowledge while learning English, children serving as bridges, families learning together in ways that strengthened rather than severed cultural connections. In Queens, the refugee community designed a program focused on what they called survival with dignity, practical English for navigating systems like healthcare and employment, but taught in ways that honored participants' professional backgrounds and expertise. A former Syrian engineer taught physics concepts in Arabic while learning English technical vocabulary. A Somali doctor led health education sessions that became language practice. Knowledge flowed in multiple directions, challenging the traditional teacher-student hierarchy. In the South Bronx, the community team developed something entirely unexpected, a program teaching both English and Spanish to monolingual speakers from both backgrounds, with the explicit goal of creating bilingual solidarity across Latino and non-Latino working-class communities. We're neighbors, but we can't talk to each other, explained one organizer. That keeps us divided, makes it easier for landlords and employers to exploit us. Language can be a tool for building power together. Helena attended these planning sessions whenever possible, often sitting silently with visible discomfort as community members challenged assumptions she'd never questioned. After one particularly intense meeting where a participant had torn apart the Foundation's standard application processes as designed to exclude people without formal education, Helena had pulled Ethan aside. I feel completely out of my depth, she admitted. Everything I thought I knew about effective philanthropy is being dismantled. How does that feel? Ethan asked. Honestly? Liberating, and humiliating, and necessary. She paused, touching the silver necklace she still wore. Frau Hartmann used to say that real learning required ego death, the willingness to discover you'd been wrong about fundamental things. I'm experiencing that on a visceral level. The programs launched in September, 18 months after that first gala where Ethan and Maya had been mocked for not belonging. The opening ceremonies in each community were nothing like traditional ribbon-cutting events. In Washington Heights, families gathered in a community center decorated with flags from every country represented in the program. Luz Morales stood at the front, nervous but determined, welcoming everyone in Spanish and English. This program is different, she said. Not because the people running it are so wonderful, no offense to Mr. Brooks and Ms. Kruger, but because we designed it ourselves. We decided what we needed, how we wanted to learn, what success looks like for our families. That's never happened before, and that's what makes it revolutionary. Ethan stood to the side with Maya, watching as community members took ownership of something that bore Sophia's philosophical fingerprints, but had grown far beyond anything she could have created alone. Maya squeezed his hand. Mom's ideas are helping people, she whispered. Yes, they are, Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. Helena approached them after the ceremony, her eyes bright with tears she wasn't quite hiding. Thank you, she said quietly, for trusting me with this, for believing I could change. You're doing the work, Ethan replied. That's what matters. I want to show you something. Helena pulled out her phone, opening an email. Wilhelm, the board member who opposed the program, sent this yesterday. He visited the Queen's site without telling anyone, just to see what was happening. He was particularly struck by the Syrian engineer teaching physics. Ethan read the email. I attended class expecting to see charity, well-meaning wealthy people helping unfortunate refugees. Instead, I witnessed genuine education, people with extraordinary expertise sharing knowledge while acquiring new linguistic tools. I was wrong to oppose this program. Please convey my apologies to Mr. Brooks and my admiration for the communities building something remarkable. He's proposing additional funding, Helena continued, wants to expand to 2 more sites. Several board members who were skeptical are now asking how they can support expansion. That's wonderful, but we need to be careful about scaling too quickly, Ethan cautioned. Sophia always warned that programs lose their soul when they grow faster than they can maintain integrity. We need to ensure new sites have the same level of community authority, not just replicate surface features while abandoning the actual principles. Agreed. Which is why I'm proposing that each new site goes through the same 6-month community design process. No shortcuts, no templates, no assuming what worked in one context will work in another. Over the next year, the programs evolved in ways both predicted and surprising. Attendance exceeded all projections. Participants reported not just language gains, but increased confidence, stronger community connections, and what assessment tools measured as communicative courage, the willingness to engage across difference despite fear of making mistakes. But there were also challenges that tested everyone's commitment to the stated principles. In Washington Heights, tensions emerged when some participants wanted more focus on formal grammar and test preparation for citizenship exams, while others prioritized conversational fluency and cultural exchange. The design team had to navigate competing visions of success, ultimately creating multiple tracks that honored different needs without hierarchizing them. In Queens, a conflict arose when a new staff member with traditional teaching credentials began correcting participants in ways that felt disrespectful. The Community Governance Board, yes, they'd created actual governance structures with decision-making authority, voted to remove the staff member despite Helena's concern about the optics. Maria Flores had been uncompromising in the subsequent conversation with funders. This is what community authority means, she'd said bluntly. Not just when it's comfortable, not just for decisions you agree with, but especially when communities make choices that make you nervous. Either they have real power or they don't. Pick one. Helena had supported the decision publicly, though Ethan knew it had been difficult for her. The board was uncomfortable, she told him later. Questioned whether community members really had the expertise to make personnel decisions. I had to remind them that respecting participants was literally the program's core value, and a staff member who couldn't do that had to go. but it was hard. Leading transformation is always hard, Ethan replied. Sophia used to say that real change happened in exactly these moments, when principles met practice, when nice ideas confronted messy reality, when people had to choose between comfort and integrity. The program's growing success attracted media attention, which brought both opportunities and new challenges. A journalist from a major newspaper visited the South Bronx site and wrote a feature that went viral, praising the revolutionary approach to language education that centers community wisdom over institutional expertise. The article brought donations, partnership offers, and speaking invitations. It also brought criticism from traditional language education organizations who felt attacked, and scrutiny from skeptics looking for failures to justify their opposition to community-led approaches. One critic, a prominent education professor, wrote a scathing response arguing that romanticizing community knowledge while dismissing professional expertise represents dangerous anti-intellectualism masquerading as social justice. The piece went viral in academic circles, leading to uncomfortable conversations about how to respond. Ethan drafted a response, running it by the community design teams before publishing. Professor Martinez critiques what he calls romanticizing community knowledge, but this represents a fundamental misunderstanding of our approach. We don't reject expertise, we expand what counts as expertise. A mother who's navigated immigration systems while raising bilingual children has expertise. A refugee who speaks 5 languages learned through displacement has expertise. A teenager translating medical appointments for grandparents has expertise. Our programs honor professional linguistic knowledge while also valuing lived experience, creating richer learning environments than either approach alone could achieve. The response sparked broader conversation about expertise, authority, and whose knowledge gets valued in educational contexts. Several prominent educators wrote supportive pieces. Others remained critical. But the debate itself felt productive, forcing explicit conversation about assumptions that usually remained unexamined. Through all of this, Ethan's relationship with his daughter deepened in unexpected ways. Maya was growing up watching her mother's work come alive in the world, seeing that ideas mattered, that education could transform communities, that ordinary people could create extraordinary change. She started a language exchange program at her own school, convinced her teacher to adopt some of Sophia's pedagogical principles, and talked constantly about becoming a teacher herself someday. One evening, as Ethan tucked her into bed, Maya asked a question that caught him off guard. "Do you think Mom knows about the programs, like wherever she is? Does she know her work is helping people?" Ethan sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what happens after we die, sweetheart, but I know that your mother's influence is alive in every person those programs touch, in every community that's building something better because of her ideas. In that sense, she's very much still present in the world." "I like to think she's proud of us," Maya said softly, "for not keeping her notebooks hidden away, for letting other people use her ideas." "I think she'd be incredibly proud," Ethan agreed, "not just of what we've built, but of how we've built it, with respect and collaboration and genuine community authority. That's what she always wanted." 2 years after the programs launched, the foundation hosted a celebration event, not a gala this time, but a community gathering at a park in Queens with food, music, and presentations from participants about what the programs meant to them. Over 300 people attended, representing all 3 sites, plus 2 new ones that had launched after their own 6-month design processes. Ethan stood with Helena and Margaret, watching families laugh and children play while adults conversed in multiple languages, the air filled with exactly the kind of genuine connection Sophia had dreamed about creating. "She would have loved this," Helena said quietly, gesturing at the scene before them. "Not formal or prestigious, just real people connecting across difference." "She always said that the best education happened outside classrooms," Ethan replied, "in moments when people chose to engage with each other authentically, despite language barriers or cultural differences." Margaret, who'd become one of the program's fiercest advocates, smiled. "I spent 60 years participating in charity that made me feel virtuous without changing anything structural. These programs have taught me more about genuine service in 2 years than I learned in the previous 6 decades." Luz Morales approached them, her confidence dramatically different from that first skeptical conversation. She'd become a paid program coordinator, was taking college classes in education, had discovered a passion and talent for curriculum development that might never have emerged without this opportunity. "Mr. Brooks, can you come speak to the Washington Heights participants? They want to thank you directly." Ethan followed her to a group gathered near the food tables, recognizing faces that had become familiar over 2 years of collaboration. They'd prepared a gift, a framed photograph of Sophia that someone had found online, surrounded by quotes from her notebooks translated into Spanish, Arabic, and several other languages represented in the programs. "We wanted you to know," Lou said, speaking for the group, "that your wife's work isn't just helping us learn English. It's teaching our children that their languages and cultures are valuable, that they don't have to erase themselves to succeed. That's a gift worth more than any language skills." Ethan accepted the frame with trembling hands, emotion overwhelming his ability to respond with words. Maya appeared at his side, leaning against him in the way she did when she sensed he needed support. "My mom used to say that the most important thing education could do was help people love themselves while learning about others," Maya said, her young voice clear and sure. "I think that's what these programs do." The group erupted in applause, and Ethan found himself surrounded by people hugging him, thanking him, sharing stories about how the programs had changed their families' lives. A teenager who'd started as a participant and was now training to be a program assistant told him she'd gotten into college with a scholarship, planning to study linguistics. A grandmother shared that her grandson had stopped being ashamed of speaking Spanish at home. A father explained that learning English while maintaining his cultural identity had helped him advocate for better working conditions at his job. Each story was a thread in a larger tapestry that Sophia had designed the pattern for, but would never see completed. Ethan felt grief and pride in equal measure, mourning her absence while celebrating her enduring presence through the work. As the sun began setting over the park, Helena called for everyone's attention. She stood on a small platform that had been set up for performances. The silver necklace, now engraved with Sophia's full name and years of teaching, catching the golden light. "2 years ago," she began, "I made a terrible mistake. At a charity gala, I used my language skills to mock people I judged unworthy of my respect. One of those people was Ethan Brooks. I didn't know that he understood every cruel word I said. I didn't know that his late wife had been my teacher, someone who'd believed in my potential and tried to teach me that language should build bridges, not walls." The crowd had gone quiet, giving Helena their full attention. "That night changed my life," she continued, "not because I was publicly humiliated, though I was and deserved to be, but because I was confronted with the gap between who I thought I was and who I'd actually become. My teacher, Frau Hartmann, had given me tools for creating connection and understanding. I'd turned those tools into weapons of exclusion and cruelty." She paused, visibly emotional. "These programs exist because Ethan Brooks showed me grace I didn't deserve, because he believed that people could change, that mistakes could become opportunities for growth, that even someone who'd failed to live up to their teacher's hopes could learn to do better." Helena looked directly at Ethan. Frau Hartmann's work has now touched hundreds of lives directly, and thousands more indirectly as our model spreads to other communities and contexts. But more than that, her philosophy, that language education should expand our capacity for empathy, that true learning requires humility, that respect and dignity matter more than formal correctness, that philosophy is changing how we think about education itself. She turned back to the crowd. "So this celebration isn't just about successful programs or impressive metrics. It's about honoring a teacher who believed in transformative education, about recognizing the communities who made her vision real, and about committing to continue this work with the same integrity and respect that she modeled in every aspect of her teaching." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Ethan saw people wiping away tears, saw Maya beaming with pride, saw community members who'd built these programs from the ground up receiving the recognition they deserved. As the evening wound down and families began heading home, Ethan found a quiet moment to sit on a bench overlooking the East River. The framed photograph of Sophia rested against his legs, her face forever frozen at an age she'd never exceed, her smile capturing the warmth and intelligence that had drawn him to her years ago. Helena approached tentatively. "Is it okay if I sit?" "Of course." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "I've been thinking about that quote from the necklace," Helena said finally. "The Wittgenstein. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." For years, I thought it meant that speaking multiple languages gave me access to bigger, better worlds than people who only spoke one language. I used it to feel superior. "And now?" Ethan asked. "Now I understand it differently. The limits aren't about how many languages you speak. They're about how you use language. If I use it to exclude, to mock, to maintain hierarchies, then my world stays small no matter how many languages I know. But if I use it to listen, to connect, to understand perspectives different from my own, then even imperfect communication in a single shared language expands everything." Ethan smiled. "Sophia would have been pleased to hear you say that. That's exactly what she meant when she talked about language as a tool for building bridges." "I'm planning to step back from the Foundation's day-to-day leadership," Helena said. "Not leaving entirely, but transitioning to a supporting role while elevating community leaders into formal director positions. Luce in Washington Heights, Amir from the Queens refugee community, Carmen from the South Bronx, they should be the ones leading this work, not me." "That's a big decision." "It's the right decision. I've learned a lot, grown a lot, but ultimately this work belongs to the communities it serves. My role should be providing resources and removing barriers, not being the face of programs I didn't design and don't fully understand." She paused. "Besides, I'm starting a new initiative focused on reforming foundation practices more broadly, teaching other wealthy philanthropists to get out of their own way, to stop treating charity as performance, to actually listen to communities they claim to serve." "Sounds like you're taking Sophia's principles and scaling them in a different direction." "Trying to, anyway. With your permission, I'd like to use her frameworks and our experience as a case study. Show other foundations what's possible when you genuinely commit to community authority rather than just talking about it." Ethan considered this. "As long as the communities we've worked with are compensated for their time and expertise if they participate, and as long as their voices are centered, not ours. We were facilitators, not saviors." "Agreed completely." Helena stood, preparing to rejoin the remaining guests. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything, for giving me a chance to become the person Frau Hartmann believed I could be." After she left, Ethan sat alone with Sophia's photograph, thinking about the impossible path that had led from a humiliating gala to this moment of genuine celebration and community transformation. None of it had been easy. There had been setbacks and conflicts, moments when he doubted whether he was qualified for this work, times when maintaining integrity had meant difficult confrontations with people who had power and resources he needed. But here, looking at the evidence of Sophia's enduring influence, Ethan felt something he'd struggled to access in the 3 years since her death. Not just grief for what was lost, but gratitude for what remained. Her ideas lived on, adapted and enriched by communities she'd never met, touching lives in ways she'd never imagined, creating ripples that would extend far beyond any single program or initiative. Maya found him eventually, tired but happy, ready to go home. As they walked toward the subway, she slipped her hand into his. "Dad, do you think we did good, with Mom's notebooks and the programs and everything?" Ethan looked down at his daughter, this remarkable young person who'd lost her mother far too young, but had somehow transformed that loss into purpose and meaning. "I think we did exactly what your mother would have wanted," he said. "We took beautiful ideas and shared them. We honored her belief that education should transform systems, not just help individuals navigate unjust ones. We built something based on respect and dignity and genuine collaboration. And people are kinder now than before," Maya added. "That was always her best test, remember? Whether learning made people kinder." "Yes," Ethan agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "People are definitely kinder." They descended into the subway, leaving behind the park and the celebration, returning to their ordinary life in their modest apartment. But ordinary felt different now, not limiting, but grounding. This was still home, still the place where he and Maya built their life together. The programs, the foundation work, the public recognition, those were important, but they didn't define everything. What mattered was that Sophia's legacy lived on not as a monument to a single person, but as a living practice of building bridges, honoring dignity, and believing that language could expand rather than limit our worlds. What mattered was that communities had tools for creating change on their own terms, with their own authority. What mattered was that a moment of ugliness and mockery had transformed into an opportunity for genuine growth and structural transformation. Later that night, after Maya was asleep, Ethan pulled out Sophia's notebooks one more time. He'd shared so many of them with the programs, with Helena's new training initiative, with researchers studying community-led education models. But he'd kept a few back, the most personal ones, filled with reflections on teaching, but also on love, parenthood, hopes for Maya's future, and her own grappling with mortality as illness progressed. He opened one to a passage written shortly before her death, her handwriting weaker but still recognizable. "I won't live to see whether my ideas work at scale. I won't know if the frameworks I've developed will actually transform education, or if they'll be filed away as interesting theory that's too challenging to implement. But I have to believe that putting these thoughts on paper matters, that someone might find them useful, that seeds planted can grow even after the gardener is gone. Ethan will make sure Maya knows I tried to build something better. That's enough. It has to be enough." Ethan closed the notebook gently, his eyes wet with tears. She'd had no idea that her ideas would reach hundreds of families, would spark foundation reform, would challenge traditional approaches to language education across multiple contexts. She'd simply trusted that trying mattered, that integrity mattered, that planting seeds was worthwhile even without certainty they'd grow. And they had grown, wild and beautiful and strange, shaped by communities she'd never met, but whose wisdom enriched everything she'd started. The programs bore her philosophical DNA, but had evolved far beyond anything she could have created alone. That was exactly how it should be. Ethan's phone buzzed with a final message from Helena. "Board approved 5 new program sites and doubled our 3-year commitment. Also approved your full-time salary as senior advisor. No more maintenance shifts unless you want them. You've earned this, Ethan. Time to let yourself fully step into the work." He stared at the message for a long moment, processing what it meant. Financial security. Recognition of his expertise. The ability to focus entirely on work that mattered, rather than splitting himself between competing demands. It was everything he'd thought impossible 3 years ago, when medical bills had destroyed his graduate school dreams and forced him into survival mode. But it had taken Sophia's death, a chance encounter at a gala, and a wealthy woman's moment of profound reckoning to make any of it possible. The path from grief to purpose had been neither straight nor simple, but here he was, living proof that beautiful things could emerge from loss, that dignity maintained in the face of mockery could transform into lasting change, that one teacher's vision could reshape how communities approached education and connection. Tomorrow, he'd call Martinez and give proper notice, thank the man who'd shown him kindness when he needed it most. He'd talk to Maya about what full-time foundation work meant for their schedule and routines. He'd start planning for the new program sites, ensuring they went through the same rigorous community design process that had made the first program successful. But tonight, Ethan simply sat with Sophia's notebooks and let himself feel the full weight of everything that had happened, the grief and pride, the fear and accomplishment, the impossible distance they'd traveled from that night at the gala when he'd been mocked for not belonging. He belonged now. Not because wealth or status had changed, but because he'd claimed belonging by insisting on dignity, by trusting in Sophia's vision, by believing that communities deserved authority over their own education and futures. Maya's voice drifted from her bedroom, talking in her sleep about teaching and languages and making people kinder. Ethan smiled, recognizing his wife's influence in their daughter's dreams, seeing how legacy actually worked, not as static preservation, but as living evolution, as seeds that grew in unexpected directions, as love that transcended individual lifetimes. The limits of language had expanded his world beyond anything he could have imagined, and somewhere he chose to believe Sophia knew that her work continued, knew that their daughter was thriving, knew that the notebook she'd filled with hope and determination had found their purpose in the world. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.